Chapter 210. A lot of hallucinogenic gases and other toxic gases would be released in places where plants and animals intertwined, causing the animals in the plants to collapse. However, in this forest of plants, there weren't many of these high-risk toxic gases released. Instead, the toxins were stored inside the plants. The toxins were stored inside the plants, and when hostile species of plants encountered each other, they would release the toxins in their bodies, cutting through the epidermis of the plant and seeping in. Some toxins could even liquefy the hostile species and turn them into fertilizer for their own growth. Some of the arbor plants here were not completely stationary. Many of them could move. Although most of them could not move as fast as a tortoise, compared to the plants on other planets, the plants here were already very special. Many of the plants contained a variety of precious medicines. Medicines that were directly isolated from the plants contained a considerable amount of activity and were much more effective than those synthesized by machines. Moreover, some allergies and rejection reactions could be avoided. Therefore, in the League of Stars, natural medicines that were isolated from plants were worth hundreds of times more than synthetic medicines. All of this came as a pleasant surprise to Tycho and Riculap. From a few plants, they easily extracted hallucinogens and other neurotoxins that were of high purity and activity. Tycho and Lycrabe had been busy ever since they arrived. They usually didn't rely on robots to process the materials, and they usually did it themselves. The medicinal ingredients that they collected were indeed worth the trip. These medicinal ingredients were all rare natural ingredients, and 2 of them could only be found by chance. In the League of Stars, the price of these ingredients was comparable to a starship. There was also a type of evergreen shrub that grew in clusters. Its leaves and branches contained a chemical ingredient that was often used by hunters as an analgesic. It could be used to treat high fevers caused by infection. However, many synthetic drugs had high side effects. After the analgesic was administered, there would be a period of weakness. However, the side effects of this naturally extracted analgesic drug were minimal, and its biological activity was very good. This was the conclusion that Tycho and Lycrabe came to based on their own experience. To them, this place was indeed a treasure trove. Tycho and Lycrabe had already marked this planet, and in the next few years, it would probably become their herb garden. The white rabbit was nibbling on the leaves of some unknown plant with its 3-petaled mouth. Many animals had an innate intuition and could sense what they could eat and what they couldn't. Seeing Tycho's expression, it was obvious that she believed in this white rabbit's ability. Hui Mao and the others gathered some nuts that could be stored for a long time and some fleshy fruits. I kept a video feed of Sigma while I was harvesting, so Sigma was able to see their every move, comment on them from time to time, and eavesdrop on them. Those animals obviously didn't care if there were any poisonous gases or plant secretions here. At least for now, these guys were still full of energy and were jumping around. Scarlet Wind grabbed a fruit and sniffed it before starting to eat it. Wow, what's that? Shueqiu ran over and plucked a fruit from the tree. He took a bite and it tasted good. But soon, Shueqiu's attention was attracted by another tree. It was an umbrella-shaped tree with drooping branches that looked like a bell jar. What attracted Shueqiu's attention wasn't the tree's appearance, but the watermelon-sized oval balls hanging from its drooping branches. Shueqiu walked over and sniffed, then opened his mouth and bit the top of the oval ball. A moment later, some juice flowed out, and Shueqiu licked it. It was sweet and tasted good, better than fruit. So, Shueqiu stuck his mouth to the top of the oval ball and started sucking on it. The full oval ball slowly deflated. "Hey, what are you sucking on?" Hui Mao asked. Shueqiu snorted twice but didn't answer. Instead, he switched to another oval ball and continued sucking on the juice. Hui Mao jumped onto a branch and copied Shueqiu's action. He bit the top of the oval ball and licked the juice that flowed out. Then, the Miantuan and Qifeng joined in the fun. On the other side of the screen, Sigma was frustrated. It walked around the room and protested loudly. In the end, it announced, "Bring that tree back." After licking one, Hui Mao wiped his face with his paw. He completely agreed to bring the tree back, but he couldn't be bothered to care for it. "Bring some back. We must bring some back. I'll plant them in a small garden." Sigma clapped his hands excitedly. "Yeah, Little Lovag jumped on Sigma's arm in agreement. In the end, the little guys discussed among themselves and shouted, "Sillin!" Sillin mourned for them. This was fate. Sillin walked over to take a look at the tree. The juice inside the oval fruit was very nutritious, and some of the plant oils were very rare nutrients for humans. But for some of the plants that grew in this area, they were something that would cause them to retreat at the mere mention of it. These oval-shaped spheres were equivalent to the plant's fluid sacs. The fluid sacs contained a lot of plant oils that carried a sweet fragrance. The smell of the plant oils was hated by many plants, and they would retreat the moment they smelled it. But Wheeze and the others liked it very much, and so did humans. After the inspection was over, Sillin asked Cheto to take care of the plants. Sillin wasn't counting on the gluttons to do it. Even if they destroyed the entire forest, they might not be able to dig out a whole plant, not to mention that most of the plants needed to be treated for nutrients. The plants with the oval fluid reservoir belonged to the viviparous type of plant. In most plants, after a seed matured, it would usually leave the mother's body and spread out. After a period of dormancy, it would wait for a suitable temperature, humidity, and other conditions before it would germinate in the soil and gradually grow into a young plant. However, due to the complexity of the natural environment, plants had a diversity of characteristics that allowed them to better adapt to the environment and survive. Therefore, there were some angiosperms that developed like a mammal's fetus inside its mother's body. Instead of leaving its mother's body immediately after the seed matured, it would germinate inside the fruit and grow into a seedling before leaving its mother's body. That was why people called them viviparous plants. The plant's branches covered the ground like a cover, and there were many lanterns inside the cover. In fact, they were seedlings that had sprouted from the seed. Once the seed matured, it would germinate inside the fruit without leaving its mother's body. The hypocotyl would stretch out and protrude out of the fruit skin, forming many club-shaped seedlings. If one broke the membrane outside the lantern, they would see the seedlings that had yet to leave their mother's body. Therefore, Cheto didn't need to prune the mother's body or dig out the entire tree. All he needed to do was collect some lanterns. Other than this plant, there were a lot of other plants that Sigma wanted them to bring back and plant in its botanical garden. Sillin agreed to all of Sigma's requests. After all, Sigma was the one who contributed the entire base to them, so Sillin naturally wouldn't turn down a small request that would benefit everyone. After Sillin and Cheto were done processing the plants, he left the rest to Cheto. While collecting information, Cheto dug out the plants that Huimao and the others had chosen, treated them with nutrient solution and sealed them with a special membrane. Tico and Lycrabe would mark the plants that needed to be transplanted, and Cheto would go and collect the best materials later. While Sillin, Tico, and Lycrabe were processing some useful plants, Udos and Carrie had come over from the mining area. Seeing that Sillin and the others weren't wearing protective suits, Carrie and Udos also took off their protective suits. Carrie sucked in a breath and sighed. "The air here isn't bad." Udos looked at the detector in his hand and said, "Yeah, the air here is a lot better than the other side." "Hey, Shuecho, eat less. You'll have diarrhea." Shuecho was eating like a ball right now. Even Udos was worried that he might be overweight. Hearing Udos shout, Sigma asked in puzzlement, "What's diarrhea?" "Ahem, it's when you can't control your bowel movements," Udos explained. Sillin and Carrie turned their heads away and pretended that they didn't hear anything. Udos noticed that Huimao, Chifeng, and Shuecho were all looking at him, and he obviously felt a little embarrassed. He rubbed his nose and said, "Hey, you guys should hurry up. We'll be leaving once the energy ores are all mined. Judging from your speed, there's still a lot of places you haven't visited yet, right? It's rare for us to come out, so let's enjoy ourselves." These words undoubtedly resonated with Huimao and the others. Instead of worrying about why they couldn't control their bowel movements, they turned around and went to look for more exotic plants. Carrie went over to watch Tico and Lycrabe process medicinal plants. He learned a little himself. However, Udos only watched for a while before his attention was drawn to a beautiful plant. The plant wasn't tall. It was less than 2 meters tall, and there was a feather-like thing growing at the top. When the wind blew, it looked like a peacock spreading its tail. It was a beautiful sight, and it also carried a sweet fragrance. "It's so beautiful." Eudos couldn't help but take out his recording device and record the scene. While Scylla was dealing with a plant, the vines that had curled up because of his arrival suddenly grew excited. The vines stretched out with a whoosh and swiftly extended towards a certain direction, and that direction was exactly where Eudos was standing. At the same time, the vines around Lycrabe and the others also began to become excited, and at the same time, they quickly extended towards Eudos. "Eudos, be careful." Scylla quickly ran over and used his wrist blade to cut off the vines that extended towards him. When the vines behind him reached forward, he took out a bottle of spray and sprayed it on Eudos' arm. Carrie and Lycrabe also rushed over to help, cutting down the vines that extended from all directions. They didn't dare to use flames or ultra-low temperature freezing guns on their own. The surrounding environment was unstable, and the external image could easily change the environment here. The safest way was to use knives to cut down the vines. When Scylla put a protective mask on Eudos, Eudos was still a little confused. He was going to go up and cut the vines, but now he was treated like an injured person by Scylla. He was not injured. Huh. Eudos looked at his arm. There were many bloodstains on it, and the blood was still dripping down. Scylla sprayed him with a compound spray to cover the wound so that the blood would stop flowing. After wiping the blood, he threw the absorbent paper in his hand far away and pulled Eudos away from the place. After running for 50 meters, Eudos looked at the original place again. The vines had covered the place, and the place where the blood-stained absorbent paper fell was also the gathering point of the vines. Obviously, these vines were attracted to Eudos' blood. Don't get hurt. Once you bleed, it will cause a series of movements. After all, Carrie had experienced a lot of things. When he saw this scene, he could roughly infer the reason for the reaction of these plants and the various possible situations that might occur. Fortunately, Eudos was the only one injured. If everyone was injured, everyone would have to deal with the vines all over the place, and there would be no time to stop the bleeding and clean up the blood on the wound. Looking at the fine sawteeth on the vines because of excitement, the situation might get worse. Eudos panted. After putting on the protective mask, he gradually felt the pain in his arm. "What happened? I didn't even notice that my arm was cut just now." Eudos was very puzzled. Wasn't it just taking a photo? How could he be cut without feeling anything, and there was more than one wound? There was a lot of blood. Lycrabe released a floating measuring device. The measuring device circled around and came back with some data. The gas released by the plant contains a lot of nitrous oxide and a few other auxiliary gases that affect the nerves but will not cause fainting or death. After inhaling this gas mixture, the body will lose the sense of pain, but the body will still be awake. The addition of the auxiliary gas will not affect the body's movement, so Eudos did not notice it at all, Lycrabe explained. Nitrous oxide inhibited the release of excitatory neurotransmitters and the conduction of nerve impulses in the central nervous system, so Eudos did not feel anything when he was cut by the plant and bled. Eudos took a deep breath. He was so bold because he saw that Scylla and the rest were not wearing protective suits, and nothing happened. It seemed that he still had to be cautious. As a hunter, Eudos still had a lot to learn. Vigilance was not something that could be cultivated through words. Although he had experienced this incident, Eudos was obviously not frightened. Instead, he was interested. He wore a protective mask and held a measuring device in his hand, looking for similar plants everywhere. Scylla did not care about him. This was also a kind of training, and it was good to accumulate more experience. Moving forward, there was a lake. There were some microscopic algae in the lake, but there were no fish or any other aquatic animals. There were only countless unknown names of plants ranging from small to large. On the other side of the lake, there was a very tall tree. It was like a giant looking down at the creatures on the ground. Compared to it, Scylla was as small as an ant. Scylla walked over and looked around the giant tree. Finally, he came to the conclusion that this giant tree was at the top of the food chain in this area. However, there were not many of these giant trees. It was a strategy formed during the evolution of creatures to respond to the environment, and it was also the rule of nature. Scylla found a giant substance in this giant tree, and this giant substance made the tree grow bigger and bigger. After collecting some of the primitive substances, Sillin looked at the horizon. Night was coming. In the forest, the night was full of danger. There would be all kinds of wild beasts, but there were no wild beasts here. What would the night be like? Although the light receded and dusk came. At night, the most obvious thing was the row of trees not far away. The branches of those trees stretched outwards, and there was a big flower on each branch. The flower was about 20 centimeters in diameter, and it looked quite ordinary during the day. During the day, this kind of inconspicuous green flower would not attract too much attention in this colorful world. However, when night came, it would gradually emit a white light. The darker the night, the brighter the light. The plants that were attracted to the light would slowly move over, and the vines would also move over. The other branches on the tree would firmly capture these plants that were moved into the trap, cutting off the connection between them and the main body, and finally becoming fertilizer for the growth of the main body. This was the strategy of the plants, the survival technique. Because the composition of the air would change at night, Sillin and the others wore protective clothing and masks to be safe. After the glowing plants were full, the light would be dimmed or directly extinguished to save their own energy. The night here was not long, but it was enough for some nocturnal plants to have a full meal. Most of the plants were asleep. During the day and night, the plants carried out photosynthesis, respiration, movement, and sleep. In the forest where there were no insects, there was only the fleeting sound of hunting that belonged to the plants. At night, Sillin and the others saw the predation of the nocturnal plants, and saw the changes in the composition of the air in this area. It was no wonder that there were no animals in this area. In such a gas environment, many animals could not survive. This was a world that belonged to the plants. When there were no outsiders, they were the rulers of this area. The residents fought openly and secretly in the way of plants, and they multiplied. In the morning, when a ray of light shone on the plant area, there was a muffled thumping sound. It was a tree as thick as 5 people. The tree was very tall, but of course, it could not be compared to the giant tree. There was a big bell-shaped flower at the top of this tree, and the sound came from the flower above. After coming into contact with the natural light, these bell-shaped flowers began to sway, and then let out a distant sound, announcing the end of the night and the beginning of the day. After the bell-shaped flowers rang, some of the flowers that closed at night gradually bloomed, and the sleeping plants gradually woke up. Perhaps they were also thinking about hunting the next target. Sillin and the others looked at the light from the sky and continued to do what they had unfinished. A new day had begun. Chapter 2:11. By the time he received the notification that the mining operation was complete, Sillin's side was almost done with his work. The transport car had transported the seeds Cheto had prepared and the raw materials Lycrabe and the others had chosen to the spaceplane. Huimao and the others were also eating until they were full. They were all very satisfied with their harvest. Let's go. We can come back if we need anything. Sillin gathered everyone and returned to the mining site. After a quick inspection, everyone boarded the spaceplane and returned to the starship parked outside the planet. Then, they began their return journey. Every squad's operation time was different. When Sillin and the others returned, there were still 3 squads mining energy and metal ores outside. How's the harvest? Shotten asked Sillin while looking at a group of people unloading cargo not far away. Celine smiled. It was obvious that she was quite satisfied with the rewards of this voyage. Not bad. We didn't find any good metal ores, but the energy ores are passable. More importantly, we managed to transplant some of the more important plants to the planet. We'll be able to save a lot of raw materials, and the potency and quality of the medicine won't be too bad. The specific situation of that planet had already been submitted to the technical team. The technical team of the 6th B Squadron would combine the information collected by the various squads and perfect the star map. Every once in a while, they would report it to the relevant personnel of the A Squadron so that the star map of the Vanguard's area would be more detailed and convenient for their future operations. Sillin and Shotten chatted for a bit before arriving at Sigma's little garden. In the past, Sigma had only planted a few low-grade native plants in this small garden. Although the area was quite large, there wasn't much substance to it. Sigma had only come up with the idea after watching some of the old media videos stored in the base. However, after putting it into practice, he discovered that there weren't many species to be planted. There were only large patches of weeds, unlike the colorful gardens in the videos. Sigma had no idea what to plant in this small garden. This time, however, Sigma's little garden was more than fulfilling. Previously, he had stored some of the fish eggs sealed in the starship's aquarium and given them to Sigma to keep in its little garden. Now that he had transplanted these trees, Sigma believed that it wouldn't be long before the little garden became a sight to behold. Right now, Wheeze and the others were spending almost all of their time in Sigma's little garden coming up with random ideas. They had very little experience in planting, so all they could do was spout nonsense. The good news was that Sigma had done some research in this area, and Cheto was there to help stabilize their morale. More than 90% of the transplanted trees had survived. There were still a few eggs in Sigma's garden. They were Lovag's eggs. The Lovag guardian beast had entered a breeding season, but Sigma was in charge of incubating its eggs. Right now, the little garden's environment was perfect for incubation, so there was no need for special equipment to control the temperature and humidity of the eggs. A few days later, 6 or 7 second-generation Lovags had hatched. The Lovags were omnivores. According to Sigma, they ate a wide variety of foods and were very resistant to hunger. The newborn Lovags, however, weren't as resistant to hunger. Since there wasn't any extra meat, they had no choice but to eat vegetables and feed them nutrient drinks to replenish the nutrients they needed to grow. The first generation of Lovag beasts had definitely eaten meat before, and most of them were probably humans. This was Silen's judgment. When he first came to this place and encountered the Lovag beasts looked at him like they were looking at a familiar prey. These little fellows who had just been born not too long ago looked at people with very kind eyes. Perhaps the chip that replaced their brains had an executive program like that, but they had never killed or eaten meat before. He couldn't bring these little fellows along when he went out to mine, so Silen was wondering when he should catch some bugs for these little fellows to eat. Silen didn't go looking for the worm. Not long after he made up his mind, something happened on the planet before he could carry out his next operation. On this day, Shatan looked at the situation of the operations of the various squads in his hands. He wanted to make a summary because in a few days, the A Squadron would send someone over to check on the development of the B Squadrons and reward the best with resources. Shatan was engrossed in reading when he suddenly received an urgent notification from a team member. "Commander, there's a space plane flying toward us. We didn't get a reply to the warning we sent. All we got was a continuous distress signal. What should we do?" Normally, an unknown flying object would be warned first, and if the warning didn't work, they would shoot. However, the space plane kept sending distress signals, and no one responded to the 6th Division's communication link. "Are there any signs of life on it?" Shatan asked. "There are signs of life on it, but they're not obvious. They're almost completely still, so we can't get any other information." "No results from scanning the space plane?" "No, at least there are no parasites or viruses on the outside of the space plane," the team member replied. Shatan thought for a moment and asked, "How long until it arrives?" "About 5 minutes. Based on the space plane's flight trajectory, it will be outside the base's range when it reaches our planet." The coordinates are. The team member reported some of the analyzed data to Shatan. Pay close attention. Shatan's intention was to let the space plane land, but they had to be on guard. Whether the space plane was a threat or not, they had to treat it as a threat and not fight a battle unprepared. "Yes, Commander." After the report was done, the team member began to do the follow-up work. His voice sounded more excited, and it was obvious that he was looking forward to a target to vent his boredom during this period of time. After ending the communication with the team member, Shatan connected to another communicator. "Attention all squads. Attention all squads. An unidentified space plane is about to arrive on this planet." Shatan informed everyone in the base of the situation. Everyone knew what to do next. Some of the people who were sleeping got up, grabbed their weapons and ran out excitedly to meet up with their team members. Scyllin was observing the growth of the trees in Sigma's little garden. Some of the trees had already begun to bear fruit. When he heard Schotten's notification, he put down the fruit in his hand and walked out. The blue bar on Sigma's face flashed, and it quickly understood the situation through the base's reconnaissance device. But today was different. It didn't need to do anything. The 6th Division would make their move, so Sigma was very curious about what they were going to do. He ordered the little love egg on his arm to jump to the ground and left the little garden. Once everyone was gathered and assigned, there was no need for detailed instructions. This kind of cooperation had been done many times before. Alright, that's it. Let's move out. Pay attention to your defenses. As soon as Celine finished speaking, the group of people eagerly grabbed their weapons and armed themselves to the teeth and left. What's wrong, Tico? Scyllin asked when he saw Tico standing there with a frown on her face. Something's wrong. Tico pointed at the rabbit nestled in her coat pocket with her chin. Right now, the rabbit's ears were drooping and its head was buried as if it was trying to hide from something. After checking the rabbit's status, Scyllin turned on the communicator. Attention, everyone. Level 1 alert. Level 1 alert. The cheerful Carrie and the others immediately turned serious. Scyllin wouldn't casually say Level 1 alert. If he did, then it had to be a very dangerous target. After receiving Scylin's message, Schotten asked Scyllin how he came up with the conclusion. Scyllin only said that it was a hunch. Although he didn't know why Scyllin said that, Schotten still ordered the squad to be on Level 1 alert. It was too late to destroy the spaceplane. Destroying it would affect the satellites orbiting the planet, and if it got too close, it could affect the planet's B-class livable environment. They could only go on Level 1 alert. Level 1 alert? Are you kidding me? Didn't you say it was a space plane the size of a fart? Is it that dangerous? Some of the team members complained. After all, Level 1 alert was not a joke. At this time, the space plane had already passed through the atmosphere and was falling somewhere not far from the base. The people on the ground were already waiting not far from the estimated landing point. In the air, there were people piloting the fighter jet. Although Yudo's hands were sweaty, his control was still stable. Level 1 alert. Boom. The space plane crashed into the ground, creating a deep crater. The space plane was also largely damaged. Some of the team members wanted to rush up to take a look, but they were stopped. If it wasn't for Level 1 alert, they would have definitely gone up to take a look. But now they couldn't. Frick, frick. The sound of the hatch opening was heard. Through the images from the satellites in space and the monitors floating around the crater, everyone saw that there were 8 holes on the top of the spaceplane. It wasn't the hatch they had imagined. There was no logo on the spaceplane. There was no representative stamp or serial number, so they didn't know who was on the spaceplane. The spaceplane was still sending out a distress signal, but no one was in the mood to save anyone right now. As hunters, they had been through too much, and they wouldn't lower their guard just because someone was asking for help. Whoosh 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 whoosh. 8 cylinders were ejected from the spaceplane and flew in different directions. Each cylinder could only hold 1 human. Half of the cylinders were transparent, and through the transparent wall, they could see that the spaceplane was filled with humans. There were men and women, young and old, but they all looked like ordinary people. They looked like ordinary humans. 8 more cylinders flew out before the first one even hit the ground. Round after round of cylinders were ejected. Some landed directly on the ground, while others opened their parachutes in the air. However, based on their speed of descent, it would take at least 2 minutes for them to reach the ground. They were the targets of the fighter jets. Lying on Sigma's back, Shueisha suddenly felt uneasy and angry. It was a familiar yet annoying feeling, and it couldn't help but feel the urge to rush up and start killing. Aside from Shueisha, Chifeng felt the same way. A threatening growl escaped from his throat. Noticing the 2 fellows' reactions, Celine signaled everyone with his eyes to be on high alert. The cylinder closest to Cyllin's group stood upright. Through the transparent wall, they could see a woman in her 20s inside. She wore a knee-length skirt, had fair skin, and had a nice figure. Her eyes were closed, and her long eyelashes made people want to caress them. One of the team members gulped. Holy shit, It really is a murder weapon. There were a few more cylinders like this one around them. There were at least 10 of them in front of each team, and there were even more farther away. Some of the cylinders were filled with cute children, just like the first time Sillin met Tang Qiuqiu. They had pink cheeks, and they looked innocent even with their eyes closed. The uneasiness in Sillin's heart grew stronger as he thought of something. The doors of the cylinders were obviously reinforced. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been damaged even if they fell to the ground. The moment the cabin door opened, Sillin fired multiple shots, and the people inside the cabin were all shot in the forehead. The woman was one of them. Everyone was wondering why Sillin acted so quickly. Wasn't he being too impulsive? However, the next moment, everyone felt their hair stand on end. Although the people who were shot by Sillin's glabella were bleeding, the rate of blood loss wasn't as fast as a normal person who was shot. Only a tiny bit of blood flowed out of their wounds, and none of them had fallen to the ground. What the hell is going on? Before Carrie could finish, the people opened their eyes almost at the same time. Their eyes were blank and unfocused. Everyone felt a chill hit them in the face, and they started firing without hesitation. But while they were firing, the people inside the cylinders began to change. Their bodies began to grow taller and swell. Before the blood on their cracked skin could flow down, they were covered by new skin. The new skin was pale, and bloodless. The beautiful woman had become as hideous as a monster. The meridians all over her body wriggled rapidly, and her fair arms were mixed with more and more pale and blood. They quickly thickened, and her slender fingers became like the claws of an eagle. There were even lines on them. The splattered flesh and blood did not affect the people's mutation. Instead, it seemed to have stimulated the blood of these monsters. They let out terrifying roars and rushed toward Sillin's group. Every step they took made Sillin and the others tremble. Although these mutated monsters were huge, their movements were quite fast and they could dodge the shots. This was still a planet on the ground. After the cylinders in the air opened up, the people who walked out of them also began to mutate during the landing process. Bat-like wings spread out on their backs, but they were not like the membranes of bats. Their wings were thicker, and every flap could quickly change the airflow, allowing them to fly in the air flexibly and avoid the attacks of the fighter jets. Yudos controlled the fighter jet to attack one of the monsters. These monsters were very agile and had a high sense of danger, so it was difficult to lock onto them. Their long claws easily left deep marks on the fighter jet, so while attacking, they had to control their close contact with these monsters. One of the fighter jet's wing was wrapped by the long tongue of a monster. The saliva on the monster's tongue was highly corrosive, and it corroded the wing. If Yudos had not cut off the long tongue in time, 1/3 of the fighter jet's wing would have been destroyed, and its flight would have been affected. If that had happened, they would have been in danger. The monster that had its tongue severed by Yudos opened its mouth and screamed. The severed tongue was rapidly recovering, but when the monster swung its tongue, its saliva splattered onto a fighter that happened to be flying past, and 2 holes were corroded into the wing of the fighter. The situation in the air was more difficult, and the situation on the ground was not easy either. These biohumans had obviously undergone biochemical modification, and even if their heads were cut off, they would not die. This undoubtedly made the situation even more difficult for the team. This guy was simply a human-shaped weapon. This was definitely a premeditated incident. Sillin took out something that looked like a bow. An energy stone the size of a child's fist was installed on it. He aimed it at the monster at the front and pressed the button. An arc of light shot straight at the monster, cutting it vertically in half. The strange thing was, the monster that was cut in half did not bleed much. The green blood mixed with the blood seemed to have solidified, sticking tightly to the piece of meat. What was even more shocking was that the monster that was cut in half began to change. The cut began to heal, and then grew, until it became a complete body. In other words, the person that was cut in half was like some kind of animal that grew into 2 independent bodies. It was useless. It was useless even if it was cut in half. What was going on? Carrie raised his cannon and tried to blast them to smithereens, but these monsters' super high foresight didn't give him a chance to aim at all. As soon as Carrie's cannon moved over, the monsters dodged out of the way. Fuck, damn it, this is too fast. Carrie could not help but curse after his first blast missed the monster. Vice Captain, what do we do now? Someone asked. They had already taken out their lightsabers. Of course, they were not afraid of a direct melee. However, after seeing the scene of one turning into two, everyone was a little hesitant. If they were split into 5 pieces, would one turn into 5? No one could say for sure. Therefore, they were now in a predicament that they did not know what to do. Sillin had not been in contact with these guys for long. He did not have the time to analyze why these guys had such insane abilities. Do I have to grind them into mud? As soon as Sillin thought that, a long scream came from the base. Yeah, the scream this time was much louder than the one Sillin had encountered. It was so piercing that it felt like his eardrums were going to burst. The people from the 6th Division were not the most angry when these modified humans barged into the base, but the Lovag Guardian beasts. Their mission was to protect the base on this planet, and these new monsters had undoubtedly crossed the line. Yeah, there was another sharp whistle. The Lovag beasts rushed over one after another. There were some on the ground and in the air. Behind them, some of the younger Lovag beasts followed the adult Lovag beasts, waving their pincers excitedly. Chapter 212. Retreat. Everyone retreat. Sillin and the Queen retreated a certain distance away and left the battlefield to the charging Lovags. If they continued to stay here, they would definitely be accidentally injured by the excited Lovags. Sillin estimated the number of Lovags. The ratio of adult Lovags to the mutated humans was close to 2 to 1. About 2 Lovags were fighting against 1 mutated human. In terms of body size, the mutated humans were stronger than the Lovags. However, no one could say for sure since they had never seen the Lovags' true combat power. Sillin never knew why the Lovags had so many pincers, and all of them were huge. Most of the animals that Sillin had seen only had 1 pair of pincers. Therefore, when he first saw these fellows, he felt that it was strange, but he could not explain why. Now, Sillin finally knew why the Lovags had so many pincers. The charging Lovags did not bare their fangs and claws like the insect beasts that Sillin had seen before. Instead, when they got close to the mutated humans, they suddenly moved their 3 pairs of pincers. The joints on the pincers twisted in a strange way, forming a circular shield. Bang! The mutated humans were sent flying as if they had been hit by an armored vehicle. Outside the battlefield, Celine and the others were a little stunned when they saw this scene. Is this their battle strategy? Carrie gulped. If they were hit like that, they would probably fall apart. After sending the mutated humans flying, the Lovags did not stop. Instead, they continued to charge forward. They knew that their enemies would not be so weak. The mutated humans stood up after landing on the ground. Their twisted bodies wriggled and quickly recovered. They seemed to have been angered by the Lovags. They roared and charged at the Lovags, sharp bones growing out of their fingers. However, they were smarter this time. They did not charge forward directly. Instead, when they were about to hit the round shield made of pincers, they suddenly jumped up and attacked from above. Against the mutants' attack, the Lovaga beast's reaction was fast. Sillin saw one of the Lovags detach a pincer leg from its round shield and quickly clamped onto the mutant's arm. Then, it slammed the mutant's arm onto the ground. Pa-pa-pa. It was like slapping a fish. Carrie and the others were stunned again. Looking at the Lovac beast's actions, it seemed like it was a piece of cake for it to grab a mutant of this size and smash it into the ground. It was hard to tell that the Lovag beast was so strong. Just like ants, they looked like they didn't have much meat, but they could lift things that were 400 times their own weight and drag things that were 1,700 times their own weight. And this was just an ordinary ant. After being modified, the ant would be several times stronger. Sillin suspected that the Lovags had a gene that gave them a similar ability. Sillin and the others watched the battle unfold. The attack power of the Lovag beasts could not be underestimated. No matter how they looked at it, the Lovag beasts had the upper hand. Not to mention, they also had the advantage in numbers. If a Lovag beast's pincer leg was forcefully torn off by the mutant, it would quickly grow a new one. Similarly, if a mutant's hand was chopped off, it would quickly grow a new one. Monsters against monsters. They are indeed a perfect match. Carrie sighed. Hey, why don't we make a bet on how long these Lovag guardian beasts will take to deal with these mutants? Xiao Shang rested his gun on his shoulder and looked at Carrie. Sure. Carrie looked at the situation on the battlefield and raised 2 fingers. 20 minutes. I bet that they will be able to deal with these problems in 20 minutes. Xiao Shang shook his head and raised 3 fingers. 20 minutes is too short. These mutants' recovery ability is too strong. I think they will need at least 30 minutes. They definitely won't be able to deal with them in 20 minutes. Carrie looked at Sillin. Hey, Vice Captain, do you want to join in? Sillin did not immediately reply to Carrie. Instead, he turned around and took out the ultra-low-temperature cold beam freeze gun from a box. What are you doing with that? Carrie asked curiously. Something's not right. Sillin pointed in a direction. There was a mutant that had just been chopped into 3 parts by the Lovag beast. The mutant was sliced into 3 parts, the top of the shoulder, the torso, and the bottom of the waist. However, the moment the Lovaga beast shifted its target, the muscles of the mutant that had been sliced into 3 parts immediately began to contract. The portion of the muscles rapidly dissolved and formed new cells. Some of the cells in the blood also quickly gathered on the cut surface, forming a special callus. Then, under the watchful eyes of Carrie and the others, the 3 parts formed 3 new independent bodies. Each of the independent bodies was exactly the same as the mutant that had been chopped into 2. This scene repeated itself. However, a few minutes ago, Sillin had chopped the mutant into 2, and this mutant had been chopped into 3 parts. Carrie and Xiao Shang retracted their previous thoughts. If each mutant that was chopped into several pieces could become independent clones, how were they supposed to fight this war? Did they really have to blast them into smithereens? Sillin picked up the freeze gun and selected a mutant. He fired a cold beam at it. The body of the mutant that was fighting against the Lovaga beast quickly froze. However, it did not turn into a block of ice like an ordinary human. These mutants could still move, but their movements were much slower. Every movement would shake off the ice that had formed on their bodies. The only thing that was frozen was their skin. The ice that fell off was their outer skin. When the outer skin fell off, the mutants' movements would return to their original state. Imagine how painful it would be for an ordinary person to have their skin peeled off inch by inch. However, these mutants did not seem to feel the pain at all. Their eyes were only filled with killing intent and numbness. Regardless of whether these mutants felt pain or not, this was not Sillin's goal. For the Lovag beast, it was their habit to first take down their enemies, kill them, and then turn around to eat them. The killed enemies would be eaten by the baby Lovag beasts. This time, they had planned to cut the invaders into pieces and feed the baby Lovag beasts that had just been born. Who would have thought that the invaders that had been cut into pieces would come back to life? The Lovag beast's anger increased again. The mutant that was hit by the cold beam suddenly slowed down and was cut into 10 pieces by the furious Lovag beast. However, the same thing happened again. These pieces of meat started to change again. However, the time it took for them to become whole was longer than the time they were cut into 2 or 3 pieces. Sillin raised his freeze gun again and fired a few shots at the same mutant. The mutant that was hit by the cold beam had slowed down considerably. Before the mutant was hit by the cold beam, it was about to jump away from the Lovag beast's round shield. However, it was shot by Sillin before it could jump. The frozen mutant that was hit head-on was smashed into palm-sized chunks of flesh. Callie and the rest could not help but shiver when they saw this. The bloody pieces were stepped on by the mutants and Lovag beasts, and in the end, they were almost turned into meat paste. In this state, he probably won't. Before Carrie could finish his sentence, a few protrusions appeared on the meat paste. The protrusions grew bigger and bigger, and the guard's meat paste slowly disappeared. Fuck, what the hell are those things? Carrie cursed. Yudi looked at the time. It's been 10 minutes, and the number of mutants has increased by several times. The Lovag beasts are at a disadvantage now. Although the number of clones has increased, the strength of each new clone has decreased compared to their mother, Celine said. How could this happen? It's because of the cell's versatility. The cells in the mutants are always in a highly stimulated state. When a mutant is completely destroyed, the best cell will be selected from the isolated body to differentiate. The other cells will provide the cell with nutrients and energy. Therefore, the clones that are cut into less pieces will be stronger than the clones that are cut into more pieces. This is because these clones absorb more energy when they differentiate. Just as Silin said, these mutants did not necessarily realize this flaw. Instead, they instinctively began to absorb the pieces of their own kind that were cut into pieces and assimilate them into themselves. Then what should we do? Carrie scratched his head in frustration. He had no idea where to start. Moreover, the mutants and the Lovag beasts were fighting each other, and it was getting more and more intense. The smaller Lovag beasts did not approach them on their own. They only moved around the periphery. Before the pieces of the mutants were fully formed, the smaller Lovag beasts would rush over and take a few bites. However, due to the gluttony of the smaller Lovag beasts, some of the pieces were completely devoured by the smaller Lovag beasts before they fully formed. This way, there were fewer clone mutants. When Snowball saw this scene from afar, it turned its head to glance at Silin, Tang Chiochio, and the others. Seeing that none of them were paying attention to it, Snowball charged towards them with a whoosh and bit down on a mutated human that was still in the process of dividing at the periphery of the battlefield. Shuechio, hurry up and come back. Tang Chiochio said anxiously. No matter how strong Shuechio's adult form was, Shuechio was still a juvenile. His ability and temperament were not mature yet. If he was accidentally injured by the Lovag beasts or stabbed by the mutant's claws, it would be enough to make him suffer. Shuechio was just a glutton. When he saw the smaller Lovag beasts eating, he was just a little jealous. He still had some self-awareness and was a little afraid of death. After rushing over and taking a bite, he quickly ran back, chewing the meat in his mouth as he ran. Carrie and the others were speechless. Fatty, no matter what, you still have human meat in your mouth. It doesn't matter if he is a mutant or not, he is still a human. How dare you eat human meat in front of us? As soon as Shuechio returned, Tang Chiochio grabbed his ear. Tang Chiochio picked up the gun and started hitting Shuechio's fat butt. Diaz had said that disobedient children should be spanked. However, this white fatty did not seem to care about Tang Chiochio's beating. Moreover, he was not afraid of pain. With Tang Chiochio's strength, he could not even pull a hair off his body. Shuechio took the initiative to let Tang Chiochio hit his but while chewing the meat in his mouth in satisfaction. How does it taste? Hui Mao asked with blinking eyes. It seemed that as long as Shuechio said good, he would also go and eat it. Oh, crunch! After chewing and swallowing the meat, Shuechio grinned and said, not bad. Wheeze immediately ran towards the direction of the carcass and started eating. Shuechio looked at Huimao's back and looked at Tang Chiochio pitifully. However, Tang Chiochio's hand that was grabbing his ear did not loosen at all. Acting pitiful was useless. Just as Shuechio looked at Tang Chiochio with a wronged expression, Silin walked over. Shuechio was not afraid of Tang Chiochio, Carrie, or Shotten, but it was afraid of Silin. It couldn't tell why. Usually, it could play with Silin, but once it made a mistake, it didn't dare to face Silin. So when Silin walked over, Shuechio's body stiffened and its round head drooped down. Silin squatted down and looked at Shuechio. Shuechio tilted its head to the side. Silin raised his hand and turned Shuechio's head to face him. Shuechio's eyes tilted to the side, but it didn't want to meet Silin's eyes. Shing! The wrist knife in Silin's hand popped out. Hearing this sound, Shuechio shivered and raised its fat hand to hold its head. I was wrong, I shouldn't have been greedy. I didn't say that. Silin grabbed Shuechio's face. Since he was with Mo Heng, he had developed this bad habit of grabbing other people's faces. Be good, lick it. Shuechio blinked, not understanding Silin's meaning. Silin waved the wrist knife in his hand and pointed at Shuechio's tongue. Lick the knife once, and it's best if you spray more saliva. Didn't I see you spitting saliva at the Miantuan last time? Just spray more saliva on the knife. The Miantuan, who was gloating on Yudi's shoulder, shook its tail and turned its head away, not daring to look at Yudi. How did he find out about such a stupid thing? Being stared at by Sillin, Shueqiu pitifully spat saliva at Sillin's knife. Every time he spat, he would tremble. Looking at Sillin's expression, if Sillin showed any signs of anger, he would be ready to roll away with his head in his hands. However, it seemed that Sillin really wasn't angry. So the fat man spat more and more energetically. The others didn't understand why Sillin was doing this, but when Yudi pointed at the mutated human that Shueqiu had bitten, they gradually understood. The mutated human that Shueqiu had bitten had yet to fully form, especially the place where Shueqiu had bitten, there was still a bite mark. Even if half of these mutated humans were chopped off, they would quickly split into a new body. Why would there be a bite mark? And from the looks of it, there was no sign of it recovering. The reason why this split body remained this way was because of Shueqiu. Sillin had seen the mutated humans that Huimao had bitten. Although there were signs of suppression, it wasn't as obvious as Shueqiu's. Shueqiu didn't have a venom sac like snakes, which meant that the suppressor should be in Shueqiu's saliva. That was why Sillin did something that made Shueqiu spit at him. After his wrist knife was stained with Shueqiu's saliva, Sillin tidied up his equipment and rushed forward alone. With lightning speed, he slashed a mutated human that was fighting with the Lovaga beast in half. Then he quickly retreated, not wanting to continue fighting. Everyone observed the mutant that Sillin had cut into two. Unlike the mutant that had been cut into two at the beginning of the battle, this mutant did not begin to divide and recover immediately. The two halves of the mutant trembled, and no callous cells formed at the incision. Instead, the greenish blood that seemed to have solidified and stuck tightly to the flesh gradually melted and flowed out. Carrie and the others' mouths turned into an O shape. They all turned their heads to look at Snowball, a group of shining eyes. Shueqiu shrunk into Tang Qiuqiu's arms again and again. Carrie turned around, grabbed his great sword, and ran to Shueqiu. "Come, Shueqiu. Spit it out for Big Brother." After Sillin confirmed the effectiveness of his attacks, he retreated and said to the spectating Sigma, "Tell the Lovags to share some of the mutants with us later. They'll be responsible for covering for us and eating. It's best if they can finish the food fast." Everyone knew that Sigma could communicate with the Lovaga beasts. Not to mention that he was the one who implanted the chips into them. Therefore, Sigma was in charge of negotiating with the Lovaga beasts. After Sillin briefly explained the situation to Sigma, Sigma promised to complete the mission. "Are you ready?" Sillin asked Carrie and the others. "Yes." Lycrabe has already taken a sample of his saliva and brought it back for research. "I'm sure we'll get the results soon." The weapons in the hands of Callie and the others were all stained with Shueqiu's saliva. In order to spit on their weapons, Shueqiu's mouth was dry and he had to drink a lot of water. "That's good." Celine made a hand gesture, signaling the start of the operation. After holding back for so long, Carrie and the others charged toward the battlefield. Sillin looked at the situation. As long as he could slow down the cloning speed of the mutants, the Lovaga beasts would devour them before they could complete their cloning. So, after solving this problem, Sillin decided to investigate another matter. The incident this time was obviously premeditated. Those mutants were specially developed humanoid weapons, and that space plane was flying towards the planet where the 6th B Squadron was stationed. However, Sillin needed to find out which side had sent the assassins over. The mastermind would definitely try to cover up and erase all traces, but Celine still had to look for it. If he was right, the space plane would no longer exist after all the mutants were killed, and it would be even more difficult to find any clues by then. Sillin approached the spacecraft and quickly weaved between the mutants and the Lovaga beasts. It was hard to see his figure. The holes on the spacecraft that popped out of the cylindrical cabin were already closed. There was no gap for him to enter. After Sillin circled the spacecraft, he called Huimao, who was happily chewing on the mutants, over. "What?" Huimao smirked and licked his paws in front of Sillin. "Try to open the cabin door. Be careful not to let the system inside detect any signs of intrusion." Huimao paced back and forth, then squatted down in a corner of the spacecraft. Strings of characters flashed in his eyes. Chapter 213. Not long after, Hui Mao raised its head and looked at Silin. Silin, it's done. Done? Silin looked at the aircraft. He didn't see any openings. Its main hatch isn't at the side, but under its belly, Hui Mao said. Under its belly meant that it was at the bottom of the aircraft. However, wouldn't the main hatch of an aircraft of this shape usually be at the side? If it was at the bottom, it wouldn't be easy. Silin looked at Hui Mao, and Hui Mao started to dig. For a cat, it was rare to be able to practice digging to this level. Therefore, Hui Mao had always been proud of its ability to dig. With Hui Mao's help, Silin quickly entered the interior of the aircraft from the bottom. After entering, he could see the situation inside the aircraft at a glance. This aircraft was mostly used to store those cylindrical cabins. Once the cylindrical cabins were released, the inside was much emptier. He took out the detector to check. There was no special reaction. Everything was normal, but Silin felt uneasy. Thinking back to the rabbit, could it be that the rabbit was only here because of the mutated humans? It was a pity that the rabbit couldn't speak. The gray cat circled around the space plane curiously and twitched its nose. There's a familiar smell. What smell? Silin couldn't smell it out. If someone had stayed here before and hadn't cleaned the place properly, Silin would definitely be able to smell it out. In other words, the people who stayed here had been cleaned up when they left. At this time, he couldn't help but admire Hui Mao's senses that were more sensitive than a detector. Hui Mao walked around the cabin again and determined a general route. It raised its paw and pointed at the places where there was a slight residual smell. There are many kinds of smells, but there's one that's very familiar. It's probably in these few places. If the smell had been cleaned at the same time, then the places where there was a faint residual smell should be the places where the person stayed for a long time, or the places where some liquid from the person's body dripped. I remember now. Hui Mao shouted, it's that. When we went to the level 1 prison, we smelled that stench. It was disgusting like a rat. I killed a few of them, but I didn't eat them. They were so smelly and disgusting. After I killed them, they were sticky like a puddle of water. Something like a mouse? Was it as sticky as a puddle of water after being slapped to death? Wait, see if it's this one. Silin took out a small bottle from the scroll. At that time, he had collected some samples, but he had never analyzed it in depth. He didn't even get close to it. As soon as the bottle was opened, Hui Mao yelled, "This is it. It's disgusting. Take it away." As expected. In that case, it was indeed not Azrael or someone from other forces, but Fog or Wuxia. That person? Silin remembered that he only brushed past that person at that time. He didn't do anything, but Silin could feel the haze in that person's heart. So, which side was that person from? Forget it for now, there was no time to think about that. Silin's uneasiness grew stronger. There must be something else in this aircraft. But Hui Mao didn't smell anything special. What could it be? Silin analyzed the places that Hui Mao had pointed out with the residual smell. Then, he walked through a few possible routes based on the results of the analysis, but he didn't find anything. There were still 3 possible paths left, and Silin was currently walking along one of them. This path would give him a certain amount of distance from where he had stopped. However, when Silin reached the intersection point of this distance, the intense feeling of unease grew even stronger. This is it. Silin didn't doubt his intuition. Wheeze, how many people have stayed in this area before? Silin pointed at the area and turned in a circle before asking the gray cat. Not many. Only one person stayed close, right there. Hui Mao walked over and raised his paw to pat the ground. That's it. You come over first, don't get too close. Silin walked over carefully and touched his finger to the cabin wall. Feeling the information transmitted from his finger, Silin finally knew the reason for the uneasiness. There was something mysterious about this cabin wall. There were weak radioactive elements inside, but this level of radioactivity wouldn't make the human body uncomfortable. Moreover, the cabin wall was made of anti-radiation material, so the detector couldn't detect the radioactivity inside at all. The radioactive materials placed here had obviously been carefully calculated. When the amount of radioactive materials decayed to a certain extent, A box inside the cabin would mutate. The contents of the box would flow out and fuse with the materials that had gone through the decaying process, forming a high-energy bomb. The power of this bomb could blow up a thick layer of skin on the ground in this area. If it exploded now, the people from the 6th Division and the Lovag beasts outside would be injured by the shockwave produced by the bomb. The few that could survive would be heavily injured. Sillin looked at the approximate time of the high-energy bomb's formation. There were still 10 minutes left. Instead of contacting the base from here, Sillin had only activated the communicator when he was outside. If he had activated the communicator directly from inside, Sillin didn't know if there would be other mysteries that would cause this high-energy bomb to form in advance. After a brief explanation of the situation here, Shotun immediately drove a large aircraft over personally. Now that the situation of the mutants on the battlefield had been suppressed, it would be over in 30 minutes. Therefore, Shotun didn't need to supervise the battle. He drove the aircraft over and cooperated with Sillin to transport the aircraft out of the planet. As the aircraft had sunk into the ground, it wasn't easy to pull it out. Therefore, a large area around it was dug up along with rocks and sand. The commotion here had obviously attracted everyone's attention. However, before the mutants were completely dealt with, they couldn't keep looking at the aircraft. Since Sillin and Shotun had done this, it meant that there was something wrong with the aircraft and they had no choice but to throw it out of the planet. Now, what the team members needed to do was to complete the mission of getting injured. The spaceplane Shotun was piloting extended 2 large pincers and clamped down on the foreign spaceplane, carefully transporting it out of the planet. After it flew out of the planet, it sped up and threw out a couple of thrusters to attach themselves to the large piece. The thrusters pushed the spaceplane far away while Sillin and Shotun piloted the spaceplane back. 10 minutes later, the flames of the explosion ignited. As they had been pushed out of the range of the explosion, the planet wasn't affected. Sillin explained the situation to Shotun, but Shotun didn't know much about the mist and wuxia, so he couldn't tell which side did it. However, one thing was for sure. This planet was being watched. Whether it was the mist or wuxia, these two forces were extremely dangerous. The strength of the 6th Division alone wasn't enough to go against them. Therefore, Shotun reported the situation to the A-Team. Not long after, the A-Team would send someone over to check on the situation of the stronghold. They would solve the problem together. By the time Sillin rushed out of the spaceplane, the situation on the battlefield was already very clear. Only a few mutants were still holding on, and they became the targets of the Lovags. The rest of the 6th B Squadron were watching the show from a distance. Unlike the previous Lovags, these Lovags didn't directly cut the mutants into pieces. Instead, they bit them and ate them. "What's going on?" Sillin walked over and asked. Carrie raised his chin and pointed at the Lovags who were looking at the last few mutants pitifully. He then turned to the last battlefield. It seems that the more the mutants split, the more the Lovags don't like them. It was like a bowl of soup. After drinking a little, water would be added to the original spot, and water would be added again. After a few times, the soup would be diluted, and the taste would definitely not be good. In the end, the remaining mutants were eaten, and the Lovags would lick the cells that had not split in time. This time, they were indeed full. The Lovags had grown a lot, and the speed at which they ate them surprised everyone. After the Lovags returned to their nest, Shotun ordered his men to do a thorough cleaning of the area to kill any potential threats. Although the matter was resolved, the crisis it brought made Shotun feel uneasy. He only felt better when the A-Team arrived. Sillin didn't know the people sent by the A-Team, but they were all veterans like Songba Leruo and the others. However, they didn't put on airs in front of Sillin. They called Sillin over to ask about the situation and didn't ask anything else. As for what the A-Team discussed with Shotun after Sillin's departure, Sillin didn't know. He wasn't in the mood to know either. Right now, he was busy researching something that might save his life in the near future. The A-Team had left a squad behind to guard the base. They valued this place a lot, so much so that they had sent technicians over to inspect it. They couldn't stop praising the place. In fact, Sillin, Huimao, and Cheto knew that Sigma was the reason this base was as strong as it was today. Sigma had maintained, perfected, and improved the base over the years. They looked at some of the tree species planted outside the base. They were genetically modified species planted to improve the planet's environment, and now they had taken root and sprouted. Not far away, a group of little lovags were running behind Shueishio. They caught Huemao's ball every time he headed a ball over to them, and they were having a lot of fun. These lovags weren't hostile towards the people of the 6th Division just because they had eaten meat. It was because of the chips inside their bodies that they were different from normal beasts. "What are you looking at, Silin?" Huimao jumped into the room through the window and climbed onto Silin's shoulder. Silin scratched Huimao's chin and said, "You guys look like you're having a lot of fun." Huimao raised his chin for Silin to scratch. Then, he said lazily, "A bunch of brats." Silin curled his lips. "Other than being older, you're about the same as them. How's it going? How's your work?" Huimao asked while wagging his tail. "Not bad, but let me ask you a question, Whis. With your abilities, what are your chances of winning against Bart and Songba Lerwo?" Huimao opened his eyes and thought for a moment. "I don't know." To be honest, the gray cat was well aware of its weaknesses. It was confident that it could beat the duo in a head-on clash, but a battle wasn't just about brute force. Strategy was also a part of it, and Bart and Songba Lerwo looked like old foxes who had been through hundreds of battles. The gray cat's brain might be powerful, but it didn't know how to come up with many schemes. It didn't even know how to panic, and if Silin could see through it with a single glance, then there was no need to even mention those two foxes. "You want to fight with them? We can work together. You use your brain, and I'll use my claws." "I don't believe I can't beat them," Huimao said. Silin shook his head. "They're not my enemies, but I'm stronger than the two of them combined." Huimao's ears twitched. "I know. You're talking about the people you met in the prison. They were very strong, and they were also very cunning. Oh right, are they really going to attack the base?" Huimao didn't need to ask the people of the 6th Division. He could understand things through Sigma. The entire base was Sigma's eyes and ears. "I think so. Don't be afraid. I've discussed it with Sigma, and they're planning to refurbish the base and install a few cannons on the perimeter. We have the materials now anyway, and Yudi even said that he'd like to help us install cannons yesterday." Seeing that Huimao was getting excited, Silin didn't interrupt. He scratched Huimao's chin and looked into the distance. No one knew what he was thinking. 2 days later, there was another team mission. 2 rank C habitable planets were found to be rich in rare metal ores. The ores were just in time for the construction of new defense facilities. Silin's team and Zarathosha's team went out to mine. Each team was responsible for monitoring the situation on one planet. Huimao didn't come with them because he was in the middle of his excitement. Silin left Cheto at the base to supervise them. It was to prevent them from fooling around. On the starship, Silin listened to Carrie, Beaver, and the others discuss the construction of the base's outer defense facilities. He sat in silence. Unease, still unease. Silin was never a person who acted unprepared, but this time, he still felt very uneasy. Tico walked over and stopped in front of Silin. She looked at Silin worriedly. "What's wrong? Do you need something?" Silin asked. "It's not me. I just wanted to ask Lieutenant Silin what you need, or should I say, what do you expect to run into?" Tico pulled a chair over and sat down. She took out the little rabbit from her pocket and passed it to Silin. The rabbit's ears drooped, and its eyes looked at Silin with obvious worry. Silin had never seen this rabbit look like this before. There was even a hint of reluctance in its worried eyes. Silin didn't know why he could see this kind of meaning in the rabbit's eyes, but he felt that it was because of its eyes. The rabbit's mouth couldn't speak, but its eyes could. "It's been like this ever since we left the base. It always looks at you like this, but it doesn't look like this when it looks at anyone else." Tico stared straight into Silin's eyes. "What happened? Is there something you're not telling us?" Silin rubbed his hands on his face. "I can't avoid it. I can't avoid it." When he saw the rabbit's eyes, he knew what he was going to encounter. Silin didn't answer Tico's question. He closed his eyes and tapped his fingers on the back of the chair. 5 minutes later, Silin opened his eyes and stood up. He patted the rabbit that was looking at him and said to Tico, "It's okay. Tico didn't take Silen's words seriously. She knew the rabbit in her hand too well. She knew what each look meant. So when she saw the rabbit staring at Silen, she was so shocked that she dropped the knife in her hand. That look meant that Silen was likely to die this time. Otherwise, the rabbit wouldn't be so reluctant and worried. Silen went to look for Yudi. Diaz wasn't around, so he explained some of his plans to Yudi. After all, in the entire 6th Division, only Yudi had the most authority and was able to analyze problems calmly. When the time was right, it was best to be decisive. By now, their starship was quite far away from the base planet and was about to land on the metal-rich planet. However, Silen didn't give the order to land. Instead, he ordered the weapons to be ready. The members of the control room were in position to check on the energy supply and defense system. Carrie opened his mouth but was forced back by a look from Yudi. Right now, Carrie was depressed and confused. He felt like his heart was being scratched by Huemao's claws, but he couldn't ask. Ready? Silen looked at Yudi. Yudi nodded. I'm ready. Good, begin. As soon as Silen's voice fell, Yudi issued a series of orders. The starship that was originally flying towards the metal-rich planet suddenly turned around, activated its protective shield, and flew away. Carrie couldn't hold it in anymore and glared at Yudi. Right now, the protective shield was activated to the maximum. How many energy blocks had been wasted? Furthermore, they had used those special energy blocks. At this point, there wasn't even an explanation. Before Carrie, who was about to open his mouth to ask, could say anything, the starship suddenly shook. We've been attacked. Through the image on the screen, everyone could see that the starship behind them was gradually revealing its true appearance. There was actually a starship lying in ambush there. What was even more surprising was that the detectors and scanners on their starship didn't notice anything at all. The cannons on the starship behind them were all aimed at Silen's starship. If it weren't for the protective shield, the starship would probably be half paralyzed by now. At the very least, it wouldn't be able to escape at such a speed. Who are they? Carrie asked. I want to know too. Silen looked at the starship chasing after them and left the control room. Chapter 2:14. When he reached the door of the control room, Silen turned around and said to the others, as the vice captain, I'm handing over the control of this starship and the command of this operation to Yudi. Although the hierarchy among the hunters was not as strict as the military, they still had to follow the rules at critical times. Otherwise, it would be a mess. Therefore, when the situation was serious, everyone would consciously follow the orders of the Supreme Commander. But now, when they heard Silen say this, they were a little confused. Handing over control at the last minute? Since Silen had handed over the command to Yudi, they would have to follow Yudi's orders for the rest of the operation. It was obvious that the starship behind them was not to be trifled with. But Vice Captain? Carrie chased after him, ready to get to the bottom of it. But Silen did not say anything. He pressed a button, and the door to the control room closed before Carrie could reach it. When Carrie opened the door again, Silen had already taken the elevator to the spaceplane's parking lot. Silen looked in the direction of the starship behind them. He could sense the person on that starship. They would meet sooner or later, but Silen did not expect Osculos to come so soon. From the looks of it, the Fog or Wush's people must have cooperated with Osculos and attracted some of the military's attention. That was why Osculos was able to shake off the military and come to Silen. After picking a small spaceplane and taking a few energy stones with him, Silen quickly checked its weapons and equipment before flying out of the starship. Although the firepower of a small spaceplane was not as fierce as that of a large spaceplane, it was more agile. Large spaceplanes required too much firepower and were not suitable for a single person to control. On the starship behind them, that kid went out. The person who spoke was the person Silen and Huimao had talked about not long ago. It was the person who had brushed past Silen in the passage of the prison. Beside him was the woman with the blue blade that Silen had met before. Osculo chuckled as he leisurely sipped on his recliner. He finished his drink, stood up, and walked out of the room. Not long after, an aircraft left the starship and chased after Silen. Inside the starship of the 6th Division, Everyone in the control room saw Sillin fly away from the starship. Tico and Yudi looked worriedly at the flying craft that was getting further and further away from them and sighed. Sigh, I say, what is Sillin thinking? Also, who are those people behind us? Carrie was almost going crazy. Now is not the time. Yudi turned to look at the main control panel in the control room. Do not slow down or land on a nearby planet. Raise the energy shield and activate the thrusters to the maximum. Return to the base at full speed. Sillin had told Yudi not to slow down or land on a nearby planet. It would be suicidal to stop and fight. That was why Yudi had ordered his team members to return at full speed. Otherwise, they would not be able to stop the people behind them. Carrie grabbed Yudi's collar and shouted, "Can't you fucking tell us why? Is it fun to keep everyone in the dark?" Yudi looked at Carrie expressionlessly and pushed Carrie's hand away. I'm just completing the mission given to me by the vice captain and bringing everyone back to the base safely. What the fuck are you talking about? Carrie angrily kicked the chair beside his feet. The chair hit the wall and shattered into pieces. Bang bang bang. The attacks from behind were still fierce. Although the starship had an energy shield to protect it, the impact of the energy shield still caused it to sway. Fuck, who are they? Do we have to keep running back to the base like this? Carrie was not the only one who thought this way. Many others were thinking the same thing. It was too useless to return to the base in such a sorry state. The people of Vanguard were beaten to this state, and they did not even fight back. How shameful would it be if word got out? Seeing that everyone's emotions were gradually becoming unstable, there were signs that they wanted to fly out and fight or find a place to fight. Yudi finally relented. After all, it would be counterproductive to keep them in the dark too much. Mist or Wuxia, which one do you think you can fight? Yudi looked at Carrie and the others. As soon as Yudi said this, the control room fell silent. Mist or Wuxia, who could they fight? Not even one of them. It was not that they were afraid of death, but they were afraid that their death would not be worth it. Bravery did not mean that they would be sending themselves to death. Yudi glanced at everyone and turned back. Follow my orders just now. Return at full speed. This time, no one was angry. They consciously did their own things. Doing their own things was the greatest help to the team. Carrie took a few deep breaths and suppressed his emotions that were on the verge of bursting out. He asked, then Sillin, he has his own plans. Yudi did not say anything else. He opened the star map and looked at it. From time to time, he would give instructions on the route of the starship. Looking at the other party's flight, it was obvious that they had done some analysis of the area. Yudi did not expect to be able to get rid of the people behind them. He only wanted to return to the base safely. Sillin had said that the other party knew about the existence of the base. The biohuman incident last time was also caused by the other party. This time, even if their team did not come out, those people would still attack the base. When they sent the mutant aircraft, they did not use biochemical bombs or other long-lasting bombs. Instead, they only used ordinary high-energy bombs. It was for the sake of the base. When he answered Carrie's question, there was one thing that Yudi did not say. Star Hunter Osculos. A person of that level would be too much of a blow to the morale of the military. Just the Mist and Wuxia alone would put a lot of pressure on them. Adding Osculos to the mix, Yudi suspected that some people would be more passive. Therefore, even though Yudi could see that some people had questions about the aircraft, he only changed the topic. When Yudi first heard Sillin's thoughts, he was shocked. No one knew why someone of Osculos's level would keep an eye on Sillin. Sillin piloted the aircraft and flew to a planet that he had already chosen. This planet was one of the 2 underdeveloped B-grade planets that the 6th Division had discovered when they were searching for a foothold. According to Sillin's analysis of the planet's environment and species, he had the highest chance of survival on that planet. Sillin had considered taking out Osculos's aircraft in space, but Osculos was a star hunter. Not only was he experienced, but he also had better materials and tools than Sillin. Although Sillin used the special energy or that he had discovered before, which could increase the defense of his energy shield by several levels, Osculos's energy shield had to be undamaged. Once he left Vanguard's territory, Silen's chances of turning the tables would be even slimmer. Therefore, when he was simulating the route, Silen decisively chose that planet. As long as he could buy some time, Huimao and the others would come to his aid. By then, Silen's life would be spared. After all, Osculos was still alone in this place. As Silen calculated his next course of action, he dodged the attacks from Osculos's aircraft. That being said, the spaceplane's attack was nothing more than Osculos's amusement. He wasn't counting on it to destroy Silen's spaceplane, not to mention that he wasn't expecting it to. Although he did not plan to kill Silen in space this way, Osculos did not want Silen to run too far away. He did not have much patience. Osculos looked at Silen's aircraft and pressed a button on the side of his hand. A series of rivet-like objects flew out. There were 9 of them in total, and they were all aimed at Silen's aircraft. They were highly sensitive tracking devices. Silen managed to dodge 8 of them, but he was still hit by 1. The rivet-like object could absorb energy and attach it to the energy shield, speeding up the loss of energy. It seemed that Okuro could not wait any longer. After being chased by the military for so long, Osculos was not in a good mood. Silen did some calculations as he stared at the energy display that was rapidly decreasing. Then he piloted the spaceplane to avoid yet another round of energy absorption rivets. Finally, he saw the planet. Silen was about to adjust the controls and land when there was a sudden boom. 2 more rivets were attached to the aircraft. At this rate of energy loss, there was no way Silen could reach the desired landing spot. Han Shao landed the aircraft in a forest with great difficulty. He had no idea how many branches the aircraft had scraped off, but the tree branches shook the aircraft violently. Before the aircraft came to a complete stop, Silen jumped out of the emergency hatch and ran into the forest. Osculos's aircraft landed on a high ground next to the forest. The hatch opened, and Osculos walked out of the aircraft. He was still in the same outfit that Silen had first seen him in. Looking at the forest and the aircraft that had just stopped, Osculos jumped down. He was falling from a cliff that was more than 500 meters high, but he did not seem to be falling freely. Osculos looked in the direction of the forest and waved his hand. His footsteps changed. His speed did not change, but his direction changed. He followed Osculos's footsteps and landed in that direction. Selene, who was running, felt a wave of telekinesis that was rushing towards him at high speed. Silen had only ever felt a wave of telekinesis like this from Gaydar. It was too fast. Silen had already pushed his speed to the limit, but the people behind him were quickly closing the distance between them. No wonder Gaydar had said that escaping from Osculos would be difficult. Sensing the rapidly closing distance, Silen pulled out his gun, but before he could turn the gun, the barrel was snapped in half. Silen felt like he had been punched by a giant fist. He slammed into the stone wall behind him, and his whole body sunk into it. Before Selene could react, he was grabbed by the neck and dragged out of the stone wall. His feet left the ground. Osculos grabbed Silen's neck and lifted him up. He looked at the bleeding head and body of Silen and said slowly, "I'm sorry to have kept you alive for so long." Bang! Silen was smashed again, but this time, he was not smashed into the stone wall. Instead, he was forced into the ground. Silen's physical fitness was pretty good. Many A-rank combatants could not compare to Silen's physical strength. However, even with such a strong body, Osculos had managed to shatter many of his bones with just one hit, and his muscles looked like they had been forcefully torn apart. Osculos was obviously very experienced. He knew which bones to break and which could incapacitate a person. Gaydar had also said that Osculos was a person who liked to torture and kill. Silen listened to the sound of his bones being crushed, but the immense pain did not stop Silen's train of thought. In fact, every time the chip was activated, the pain was no better than when his bones were crushed. When Osculos crushed someone's bones, he would make sure to preserve the nerves so that they could better transmit the sensation of pain. "You don't seem to mind this level of pain," Osculos said slowly. Osculo was very dissatisfied with the fact that Silen did not scream in pain. A thin knife about the width of a finger protruded from Osculos's wrist. "Actually, I really hate Gaydar. He wants to replace me, But he never does it himself. He likes to use other people to deal with me. What I don't understand is that with the style of that old faker, Zada, he would waste his energy on you this time and let me be pestered by the military for so long. Tell me, how am I going to repay this debt? Osculos spoke like he was meeting an old friend, but he was swinging his knife at Silin. Inside the 6th Division's base, Hui Mao and Sigma were arguing about a design, and Shueqiu had joined in and pointed at them. Cheto didn't have the time to interrupt them at all. However, Hui Mao suddenly froze. Every hair on his body stood on end, and his eyes became as deep as a whirlpool in the ocean. Sigma, who was still explaining its reasons, suddenly stopped talking when it noticed Hui Mao's abnormality. Beside them, Shueqiu and the Miantuan backed away in unison. They felt like something was wrong with Hui Mao right now. It was as if he was about to start a massacre at any moment. The instincts of animals were very sensitive. The small Lovaga beasts that had been jumping around suddenly left the area and sought refuge with the big Lovaga beasts. It was at this moment Yudi's starship finally arrived at the base planet. Alarms blared all over the base, and everyone quickly entered combat mode. This time, however, the Lovags didn't come out. Instead, they hid inside their nests. The little Lovags trembled uncontrollably and squeezed themselves against the big Lovags as if it gave them a sense of security. Since they were prepared beforehand, they moved quickly and efficiently. Shoten ordered his men to cover Yudi's landing and attack the starship at the same time. They absolutely couldn't let them land here. Fortunately, the starship didn't try to force its way in. It simply circled around the perimeter. When Yudi's group finally landed safely, Carrie immediately told Shoten about Silin's situation. "Captain, hurry up and send reinforcements to Silin. Otherwise, he'll be in trouble if he's alone." Carrie volunteered to join the rescue team. Shoten looked at Yudi. What did Silin mean? Yudi took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down. He meant that he should leave first, and then we'll send reinforcements. Shoten clearly thought deeper than Carrie. Who's chasing Silin? Osculos. Who's Osculos? Carrie was confused. However, Shoten and the other members of the A-team almost jumped up. What? Osculos? Are you sure? It's that guy? Shoten pointed above his head. Everyone knew who Shoten was referring to by that guy. Yudi nodded. That's what Silin said. Why would Osculos have his eyes on Silin? That shouldn't be the case. Osculos has always had high standards. Someone from the A-team mumbled. When Yudi heard this, he wanted to kick the person out of the team. "Captain, now's not the time to talk about this. Hurry up and form a rescue team. I'm afraid Silin will be in trouble if we don't," Yudi urged. "Hey, who is this Osculos you're talking about?" Carrie was still confused. Another member of the A-team explained, "Osculos is the most unique and twisted lone hunter in the 6 stars of Hunt. If it was a lone hunter, then Carrie definitely knew about the oddities among the star hunters. However, the name Osculos did not appeal to Carrie. What? Carrie was taken aback for a moment before he grabbed Yudi and lifted him up. He roared, "Why the fuck didn't you tell me earlier? He's going to die." Carrie and Yudi both volunteered to join the rescue team. Although the people from the A-team looked at them with disdain, the two of them ignored them. The problem was that a few old guys were still trying to figure out the cause of the incident. Damn it, don't you think you deserve to be ignored just because you're from the A-team? You're just taking advantage of your seniority. If you have the time to figure out the cause of the incident, why don't you just go and save him? Xiao Shang and the others from the 6th Division also wanted to join the rescue team, but Shoten refused. Since they were going to face Osculos, the most suitable people to join the rescue team were the A-team. Even if the B-team went, they wouldn't be of much help. While Shoten was commanding the starships wandering outside the planet and setting up a rescue team, a large hole was broken open from the inside out of the base. At first, Shoten thought that the base was under attack, but when he saw Hui Mao in his metal form, he told his men to put away their guns and not fire at him. Hui Mao let out a loud roar after he jumped out of the hole, and the sound waves almost knocked out the people around him. Thankfully, the sound waves weren't directed at them. They would have died a long time ago if they were. Huemao's roar was directed at the starship that was circling around the planet. After the roar, all the surveillance screens on the starship turned garbled. When they finally recovered, Huimao let out another roar. This time, however, a beam of white light shot out of Huimao's mouth and headed straight for the starship. The energy shield that was originally protecting the starship was pierced by this beam of white light, and a large hole appeared in it. However, it was clear that Huimao wasn't planning to waste time with them. A pilotless spaceplane flew out of the base on its own. A figure flashed by and landed next to the spaceplane in just a couple of jumps. No ordinary person possessed that kind of jumping ability. After Cheto entered the spaceplane, Huimao jumped into it as well. Chapter 215. Neither Cheto nor Huimao touched the control panel, but the spaceplane started on its own. Every button, and every command was being input in an orderly fashion. It was the result of Huimao's control. Just now, Huimao suddenly felt a great sense of oppression and panic. It had nothing to do with itself. The cause of this sudden emotion wasn't here. It knew that something had happened to Sillin. Whis didn't like to think, but once it did, it would notice that Sillin had been behaving strangely during this period of time. When it recalled the conversation it had with Sillin not too long ago, Whis was very regretful right now. Why didn't it leave with Sillin? Why did it build this stupid cannon instead? Cheto sensed Huimao's abnormality and learned the reason why Huimao was behaving like this through the communication method unique to machines. That was why he decided to go with Huimao without hesitation. Although Huimao wanted to destroy the invading starship as much as he could, he was in a hurry to find Sillin. Never mind, I'll let these bastards go for now. Under the watchful eyes of the 6th Division and the invading starship, Huimao's spaceplane left the planet in no time at all. In fact, it didn't even bother to look at the invading starship. Something must have happened to Sillin. That cat and Sillin are connected, Diaz said worriedly. Then send some reinforcements right away. The remaining people on the starship should be enough to deal with it. Shotten turned around and went to make the necessary arrangements. On a planet with a B-grade habitability, Selene's situation was very bad, very bad. Osculos had thrown him to the ground twice, and his bones were about to fall apart. Several of his joints were crushed, and he couldn't even fight right now. There were several cuts on Silin's arms near his arteries, and blood was pouring out of them. Sillin didn't say that he would give Osculos Aurello's star map fragment and ask him to spare his life. There was another reason Osculos wouldn't spare Silin's life, not to mention that Sillin wasn't the kind of person Osculos was. Osculos had no intention of asking Sillin where Aurello's star map fragment was. As soon as Sillin died, the fragment would sense it, so Osculos was just enjoying the pleasure of torturing someone. Osculos was a madman. He had killed countless people, and most of them weren't because of hatred. Those people died very miserably. They were all tortured to death. Sillin had never understood why people like Osculos, such as the other 5-star hunters, the few in the military, or the political organizations in the Alliance, didn't do anything about it. After all, a person like Osculos was too dangerous. He didn't care who you were from the military or the Big Four. Anyone who ran into him was doomed. No one could guarantee that something like this wouldn't happen to one of their own, let alone a ticking time bomb like him. That was why Sillin and Cheto had worked together to hack into some databases. They hacked into the databases of the military and the Big Four, as well as the core databases of other important organizations. Although they didn't get any direct information, Sillin came to a conclusion based on the bits and pieces of information they got. There were some violent organizations behind Osculos. Of course, to Osculo, those groups were just tools that he could do without. He was still a self-centered, maverick man. He had no friends, no allies, and only a bunch of violent people who weren't even loyal to him. Then, it was these violent groups that posed a huge hidden danger and threat to the entire Alliance. After all, there were far too many such violent groups in the Alliance, and peace wouldn't cover every part of Jil. There were even more places like the war-torn planets at Sector V that existed in the Alliance. That being said, there were plenty of times when the military and politicians would negotiate with Osculos to keep these violent organizations in check. It was a balance. Just as Gaidar had said, a star rank hunter wasn't just about personal strength. It was also about their influence. Every star rank hunter was incredibly influential, even Osculos, who was known as the most unique star rank hunter. Osculos licked his knife, but there wasn't any blood on it. The knife wasn't stained with blood, and the droplets of blood would drip down the blade on their own. I heard that you're the one who killed that little skeleton. Little skeleton? Silen's pupils shrank abruptly. Skeleton King Caranio? You remember now? Osculos moved his fingers, and a new wound appeared on Silen's thigh. It was another wound that was bleeding. I was hoping that the little skeleton would make some noise, but you killed it before it could, Osculos said, as if he were talking about a pet he used to have. Silen couldn't see any hatred or resentment in Osculos's eyes. There was only a tiny bit of regret. It was regret that Silen killed Caranio too early. It was regret like a pig that was thrown into a pot before it was fully fed. You want to cough? Avenge him? Silen coughed out a bit of blood and said, Avenge? Osculos flicked his knife carelessly, and the tip of the knife left a new bone-deep wound on Silen's leg. Right now, every time Osculos made a cut on Silen's leg, Silen would scream in pain. Osculos was very satisfied with the sound. Does he have the right? He's just a useless piece of trash. Back when Caranio wasn't Skeleton King yet, Poison Fong didn't exist in the world, and Caranio ran into Osculos when Poison Fong wasn't a violent organization in Sector V yet. However, Osculos was in a good mood at the time, and he noticed that Caranio's bloodline was a little special. Not only did he spare Caranio's life, he even strengthened Caranio's constitution and told Caranio that Osculos would punish Caranio if he couldn't take down that area in a year's time. After that, Osculos left the area. He wasn't the kind of person who would stay for any force or organization in the first place, so he went off to find his own fun. A year later, Poison Fong ruled over that area, united the violent organizations in the area, and killed all who refused to obey them. They became a new rising force. That was the birth of the Skeleton King, Caranio. At the time, Silen discovered traces of artificial carving on Caranio's body, but he never found a clue as to why. Osculos was the one who did it. Osculos thrust his blade into Silen's abdomen while saying this. Then he slowly pulled the blade out of Silen's body and stared at the blood dripping off the blade. The blade turned completely bloodless once more. Silen let out a loud cry and started convulsing all over his body. Right now, Silen's body was covered in dozens of cuts of various sizes, and the ground was covered in blood. Although the blood loss and wounds weren't enough to kill him, it was still excruciating. So, he's going to be disemboweled soon, isn't he? Osculos seemed to think that this was fun, so he stabbed Chin Lai a few more times. But when Osculos stabbed Chin Lai again, Silen's body twitched a little, and Osculos's blade hit Silen's navel. Suddenly, flying needles that looked like chick feathers suddenly shot out of Silen's navel and headed straight for Osculos. Osculos jumped back and swung his blade to block the needles. While Osculos was swinging his blade to block the needles, metal bands emerged from Silen's body and wrapped around Silen. Then, a tablet unfurled on Silen's back, lifted Silen, and flew away at high speed. Silen had spent a lot of extremely rare materials and a huge amount of brainpower to create this device. The advantage of these two devices was that they could catch the enemy off guard. Otherwise, they would be completely useless if the enemy noticed and took precautions against them. Silen had been waiting for an opportunity all this time. Judging from the information he received from Gada, Osculos would not only bleed a person, but also disembowel them. He wouldn't kill them in one go. That was why Silen had set up the needle device on Chin Lai's abdomen. With Osculos's abilities, Silen wouldn't be able to activate the device with his weak telekinesis, nor would he have the chance to activate it manually. Therefore, it would be best if Osculos activated the device himself. Silen's painful wails and spasms were just a ploy to numb Osculos. Plus, Silen was nothing in Osculos' eyes. Plus, Silen's joints were crushed by Osculos, and Silen was cut so many times. That was why Osculos was a bit careless at the time. When the knife went down, Scylla pretended to be panicked and in pain, so that the tip of Osculos' blade could just touch the device's mechanism. The most important thing for a person was to know their own limits. Scylla knew that he would be caught by Osculos. If he wanted to attack this star hunter, he had to get very close to him to have a real chance of injuring him. Given Osculos' way of doing things, he wouldn't let his guard down unless he was allowed to stab him. Moreover, Scylla was sure that Osculos wouldn't stab Scylla's vital organs. He wouldn't even hurt his internal organs. It would only make Scylla bleed a little more. After all, Osculos' hobby was to torture people. The reason Scylla endured the cuts was to lower Osculos' guard as much as possible. He ordered Osculos to slash him a few more times while calculating the best time to act. Every part of this series of actions had been carefully calculated by Scylla, and he had rehearsed it many times in his mind. The metal plate quickly carried Scylla away from Osculos. Osculos, who had blocked the flying needles, looked at the holes on the ground and the edges of his clothes that had been corroded by the flying needles. With a flick of his wrist, he swung the knife twice in the air, shaking off the corrosive smell. Then, with a wave of his hand, a hoverboard flew to Osculos' feet. Osculos hopped on the hoverboard and chased after Scylla. While Scylla was being carried away, he did not stay idle. Instead, he looked at the surrounding terrain and environment. When he saw a forest, his eyes lit up with joy. That place was not far from the place he had expected. Scylla took something out of his ring and tossed it into the air. Then he put on his protective mask. When the thing flew into the air, there was a loud explosion. For a moment, 100,000 square kilometers of the sky was covered in smoke. It created a heavy smog that severely affected vision. Osculos, who was chasing after him, didn't expect Scylla to do something like this. Although he had encountered some small fries who threw smoke bombs before, Scylla's smoke bomb was a little too big, wasn't it? If one looked from outside the planet, the entire area would be covered in smoke. It was too big for Osculos to disperse in a short amount of time. Fortunately, Osculos stopped and used his mind to sense the situation around him. The kid had hidden his presence very well. Osculos couldn't sense Scylla's exact location even after he was a certain distance away. He looked at the scanner. It was obviously affected by the smog. Even though he didn't know how the kid had created a smog weapon like this, he had to admit that the kid had some skill. Not only did he have so many traps, but he also had such a big trick up his sleeve. Osculos wasn't angry. Instead, he was excited. Interesting. He liked hunting like this. It was too boring to kill in one go. It was more fun with some twists and turns. After throwing out the smoke grenade, Scylla threw out a few more small cans before it landed at the predicted spot. The jars broke open as soon as they hit the ground, and the contents melted into the ground. Be it the flying needles, the smoke bomb, or the small jars, they were all tools that Scylla had researched to save his life based on the information he had gathered about Osculos' style. It turned out that these methods were indeed useful. However, he would have to pay a price. Some blood and broken bones were nothing compared to losing his life. The location that Scylla had chosen was not a safe place. Instead, it was one of the most dangerous places on the planet. That was because there was a dangerous species in the forest, lizards. In this jungle area, there lived some big guys that were more than 5 meters long and weighed more than 200 kilograms. They were definitely at the top of the food chain here, and they were the largest poisonous animals of this generation. Even giant pythons had to take a detour when they saw them. Despite their small size, they were ferocious when they pounced on their prey. They could run very fast too. These lizards had strong necks and sharp teeth, which allowed them to attack fiercely. Their skin was hard and rough, and there were many bumps on their bodies. There were spikes on their backs, dark brown scales, and huge, sharp teeth in their mouths. These violent, ugly, cold-blooded creatures would make anyone who saw them shudder. However, Scylla was very excited when he saw them. Fortunately, they did not all run away today. There were quite a lot of lizards around the nest. When he saw the mountain behind the big guys, Scylla knew that he had arrived at his destination. However, a giant lizard like this wasn't something Scylla could rely on. It was nothing more than a common prey for Osculos, and he could come and go as he pleased even if it was an entire lizard nest. Therefore, Scylla would add something special to them. Scylla used all his energy to heal one of his arms. Now it could hold a gun steadily. Scylla took out a modified gun and controlled the direction of the metal plate. At the same time, the gun in his hand also fired multiple shots. The first shot hit the side of a lizard's mouth. The bullet exploded into pieces when it hit its thick skin. Some liquid flowed out of the broken bullet. The lizard growled angrily when it sensed that it had been attacked. Their cries were very hoarse and sounded very strange, giving people a creepy feeling. Scylla's shot had missed. The wound on his arm still affected him, but he quickly adjusted. The second bullet went straight into the lizard's mouth as it screamed. When one lizard screamed angrily, the other lizards opened their mouths to scream as well. This was communication between them. Scylla's next few shots went straight into the mouths of the screaming lizards. However, there were two that Scylla could not find a chance to shoot at. The giant iguanas hissed as they chased after Scylla. In reality, some of the giant iguanas did not need to crawl over. They only needed to stand guard, and Scylla would go over. This was because Scylla's target was the cave, the giant iguana's nest. At the entrance of the cave, there were 6 or 7 lizards lying there. They looked at Scylla with cold and ferocious eyes, and their tongues flicked from time to time. Scylla controlled the direction of the metal plate to avoid the lizard's big claws. If he was hit by those big claws, Scylla would definitely die on the spot. A big claw grabbed over, and Scylla controlled the metal plate to dodge. The big claw only grabbed the edge of the metal plate, leaving a mark. Scylla had analyzed the attack power of these big guys' claws. They were quite powerful, which was also one of the reasons he chose these lizards. Feeling the stench from the lizard's mouth, Scylla fired while controlling the metal plate to fly into the lizard's nest through the gap between the 2 lizards at the cave entrance. After entering, Scylla immediately sprayed some potions on himself. These potions could conceal his scent, which was very similar to the surrounding lizards. At the same time, Scylla pressed a button on the metal plate. Then, Scylla, along with the metal plate, gradually disappeared. Of course, he wasn't actually vanishing. He was just turning invisible and distorting the air around him to confuse his vision. Moreover, he had lowered his body temperature to match his surroundings. This way, it didn't matter if the lizards were looking at him through heat or light reflection, they wouldn't be able to detect him easily. The wound had already been sealed with a liquid spray film, so the blood would not flow out again. Therefore, Scylla, who had already treated the wound, stayed quietly inside the lizard's nest. He watched the giant lizard run inside angrily, then crawl out again. He breathed carefully through his mask. Sometimes, even the slightest abnormal breathing could alert these big guys. Pala, pala pala. The sound of raindrops hitting the leaves could be heard outside. This sound was like the sound of nature to Scylla. The rain of this generation had always been unpredictable and unpredictable. It came and went abruptly. But now, Celine looked at the falling rain outside and the corner of her lips curled into a smile. Although he had calculated that it would rain every day in this area, he could not calculate the time of day. Timely rain. Chapter 216. In the jungle, after every rain, there would always be new characters that stood out. Perhaps they were just unknown at first, but they would gradually improve and then amaze the world with a single brilliant feat. The increasingly heavy rain washed away the haze in the air, and the raindrops fell to the ground along with the suspended particles in the air. The blurry scenery gradually became clearer. The giant lizards seemed to enjoy the rain today. They stayed outside and let the rain wash over them. On the other side of the forest, Osculo walked at a steady pace. He did not ride a hoverboard or fly a drone. Osculo's strength lay in his perception, which surpassed that of a machine. As long as he wanted to find his prey, he would definitely be able to find it. This was the perception of a top hunter. Osculo liked to solve problems in a primitive way. Gaydar had said that Osculo was a cruel and arrogant person. He would only fiddle with equipment when he was not paying attention. In reality, he trusted himself more. No human or machine could change his mind, even if it was wrong. Therefore, the leaders of many violent groups that were related to Osculo were more or less influenced by his habits. For example, Skeleton King and Caranio were like this. In the rain, Osculo did not use any mechanical equipment. He wore the hood on his coat and walked in the rain. He felt that the machine was an irritating thing, always chattering beside him, annoying him to no end. If Scylla knew what Osculo was thinking, he would be amazed at Osculo's understanding of machine language. However, Osculo was not a person who listened to others' opinions. Osculo put away his long sword. He did not like his blade to be stained with anything other than blood, especially the raindrops that he considered dirty. Osculo did not move quickly, but he was very purposeful. He confirmed a direction and kept walking in that direction. He did not doubt that he would be able to find his prey. The direction that Osculo was walking in was the lizard nest that Scylla was in. At this moment, Scylla, who was hiding in the lizard nest, was focusing on recovering his body. He had already injected himself with the quick-acting medicine that he had prepared beforehand. Moreover, his own recovery rate was astonishing. The wounds on Scylla's body, big and small, had already begun to heal. The smaller and shallower wounds had already begun to scab, and the bigger and deeper wounds were rapidly healing. The muscles that had been severed seemed to be connected by strands of silk. They closed up and then fused into one, returning to their original state. A few broken meridians also stretched out and connected spontaneously. Blood began to circulate normally again. The shattered bones healed without a sound, as if they were executing a set of procedures. Every step seemed to have been carefully calculated, and every step was perfect, returning to its original position. As for breathing, Genya had once said that people would have a specific breathing pattern in different situations. You could determine a person's physical condition just by looking at their breathing. When the body healed spontaneously, there would be an optimal breathing rhythm. Under this optimal rhythm, the body would be able to recover efficiently with medicine in the shortest time possible. Many people who often experienced life and death situations would not pay attention to the rhythm of their breathing when they were recovering. Instead, they would follow their instincts. Experience had made their bodies accustomed to that rhythm. Scylla was one of them. He did not need to deliberately adjust his breathing rhythm. With his eyes closed, Scylla felt the recovery of every part of his body. He also felt every pore and every hair on his body to reflect the condition of his surroundings. His heartbeat. There were many heartbeats, and they did not just belong to Scylla. There were many lizard eggs in the lizard's nest, and heartbeats of varying intensity could be heard coming from the eggs. Scylla's heartbeat was mixed in, and these lizard eggs provided Scylla with the best cover. As for the lizards outside the cave, the medicine that Scylla had shot into their mouths had already seeped into various parts of their bodies. However, the medicine's effects would not be too obvious in a short period of time. As long as the lizards did not have strong emotional fluctuations, the medicine's effects would not immediately show up. Scylla, who was recovering with his eyes closed, suddenly opened his eyes and looked in a direction outside the cave. Not long after, the lizards outside also looked in that direction. They stuck out their forked tongues and stared in that direction with cold eyes. Their animal instincts told them that a troublesome fellow was coming. The rain in the forest came and went quickly. The light shining through the clouds shone in their direction. Tender sprouts had sprouted all the way from the forest to the grassland. It seemed to be full of life. A drop of water slid off a tender leaf and created a series of ripples in the puddle on the ground. A spider-like creature smaller than a sesame seed crawled down from the leaf and dragged a crystalline thread behind it. A person slowly walked out of the shadows of the forest. It was Osculos. He did not hide his tracks or the sound of his footsteps. He liked the fear his prey showed when they heard his footsteps. Osculos faced the lizards. These ferocious-looking creatures were at most small prey in his eyes. He could kill them with a simple swing of his blade. Do you think you can escape from my blade by hiding in the holes of these little worms? Osculos chuckled. Although the laughter was very soft and not suppressed, It made people feel as if the sky was filled with blood. The lizard at the outermost edge crawled toward Osculos. As it crawled, it stuck out its tongue and swung its tail, turning the grass on the ground into dust. Osculos did not dodge when he saw the lizard crawling toward him. Instead, he watched the poor prey's movements with interest. The lizard moved faster and faster, its sharp claws splashing mud everywhere. When the lizard opened its mouth to bite Osculos with its sharp teeth, there was a flash of white light from the metal, and the lizard was split in half. Blood splashed out and mixed with the puddles on the ground that had not yet dried up. Scylla closed his eyes again and focused on healing his wounds. He ignored Osculos, who was standing not far from the cave. The hunt had only just begun. The lizards were enraged when they saw their comrade killed. The smell of blood in the air further stimulated their violent instincts. They roared hoarsely and crawled toward Osculos. This time, however, Osculos narrowed his eyes. These lizards were changing rapidly. Their entire bodies were changing as if someone was inflating them. With every step they took, they would swell up. The further they went, the more their cells were stimulated to divide, and the faster they expanded. The rough skin on the surface of their bodies became thicker and thicker, and the thorns on their backs stood up like spears. With every step the lizards took, the ground trembled more and more violently. By the time they reached Osculos, they were almost 10 times their original size. Osculos raised his hand and slashed each of the 5 lizards. This time, however, they were not cut in half like the first lizard. The blood stopped flowing and the wounds healed. In fact, they had swollen even more in the short time it took for Osculos to attack. Osculos looked around. More than 80% of the lizards had started to swell and become violent. The lizards that did not change were eaten by the mutated lizards. Osculos did not know if the changes in the lizards had anything to do with Scylla, but one thing was for sure: Scylla knew that the lizards would change, which was why he hid here. In truth, the substance Scylla had injected into the lizards' mouths was a substance he had extracted from the giant tree on the plant planet. He had modified it to become the medicine he was using on the lizards right now. The medicine would make the lizards gigantified, but at the same time, the unnatural gigantification would make the lizards lose their sense of self. They would become violent and bloodthirsty, which was why they would kill their own kind that did not change. The mutated lizards charged at Osculos. Facing more than 10 mutated lizards, Osculos was not going to have an easy time. However, this did not mean that Osculos could not cut the lizards in half with one slash. Inside the cave, Scylla did not open his eyes, but he had a gun in his hand and was loading it with bullets. Although Scylla's movements were very quiet, Osculos could hear him clearly from outside. He was especially sensitive to danger. The gun in Scylla's hand was aimed at him, and Osculo himself was feeling a strong sense of danger. This was why he was paying extra attention to Scylla. Scylla abruptly opened his eyes the moment the giant lizards pounced at Osculos. Then, he raised his gun and emptied every single bullet in it. The lizard cave was not a straight line. It had a small curve, so Scylla could not see outside from where he was. However, Scylla's bullets followed a strange curve and flew out of the cave, heading straight for where Osculos was. Every bullet grazed the gaps between the lizards. Osculos swung his sword, deflecting all the bullets with a clang. He had an energy shield, but Osculos did not want to use it. He felt that using one would be a sign of weakness. Plus, the barrier would slow him down. Osculo trusted himself more than the barrier. Most people, even Scylla, would not have the time to deal with the incoming lizards after blocking all the bullets. The lizards could crush them with a single stomp. But Osculos could. Almost as soon as he blocked the bullets, the light from his sword flashed. The lizard at the front was cut in half before it could crush Osculos to a pulp. It was no longer 5 meters long, but 100 meters long. Osculos had managed to cut it in half with a single slash. It was not a simple slash. There were too many factors that went into it, such as strong concentration, perfect integration of the mind and the sword, and skillful and precise swordsmanship. Although only a third of the blade had sunk into the lizard's body, the wound was torn open. It was as if some powerful force had torn the lizard apart. The slash was so fast that it was impossible to see the shadow of the blade. All that could be seen was the lizard that had been cut in half. This was only the beginning. Before the lizards could react, they were cut in half. Even though they had thickened their skin and strengthened muscles and bones, they were just pitiful prey to Osculos's sword. The blood on the ground became thicker and thicker, and the stench of it spread. Osculos, who was immersed in the excitement of the blade cutting through flesh, did not notice that the grass around him had begun to grow crazily, and they were also heading in his direction. In the air, thin threads floated in the wind. At one end of the threads were tiny spiders the size of sesame seeds. Some of these spiders landed on the ground, while others landed on Osculos's body. The ones that landed on the ground also crawled in Osculos's direction. The dozen mutated lizards had been cut down in less than a breath's time. The giant lizard on the ground was still twitching, and blood kept flowing out. Osculos was about to go look for Scylla after he was done with the giant lizard, but he suddenly stopped and looked around vigilantly. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Vines curled in from all directions like a beast that had seen a delicious meal. Osculos had seen many strange plants before, and he knew that plants were often scarier than animals, so he cut them down one by one. However, these plants grew too quickly. It seemed that as long as he did not uproot them, they would continue to grow. Osculos slashed at the vines again and again, lifting them up along with the soil. However, unlike the plants he had seen before, these vines didn't stop growing after they left the soil. Even when they were lifted into the air, they didn't stop growing. When they landed on the ground, their roots quickly grew back, and the vines that were chopped off would grow into a few more plants after they landed on the ground. One of the vines that had fallen on the lizard that had been cut in half quickly took root in the carcass and grew madly. Osculos swung his sword and cut down the vines that came at him while looking for a chance to kill the kid hiding in the cave. Just then, a sound came from inside the cave. Osculos also sensed that Scylla was heading toward the cave. Humph, is that kid trying to sneak up on me? It was not that Osculos looked down on Scylla, but he looked down on everyone other than star hunters and heavenly edict warriors. To him, this little bastard was just a young man who had not seen much of the world and had not been through many life-and-death situations. Although Osculos looked down on Scylla, he still spared some of his attention to observe Scylla's movements while chopping down the wildly growing vines. The moment Scylla walked out of the cave, Osculos abruptly spun around and swung his blade at Scylla. He was incredibly fast, but Scylla was prepared for it. He activated the energy shield around his body. However, the shield was broken almost as soon as it was activated. The fact that Osculos's sword was able to break through an energy shield activated by a special energy block without being damaged showed how good the material was. Although the shield was broken, it still slowed down Osculos's movements. Scylla used this time to fire another round of fiber needles. When Osculos returned to block the needles, Scylla gave him a slash. It did not hit Osculos's vitals, and Scylla could not find the right time to do so, so he had to settle for the next best thing. Osculos's arm was cut, but Scylla's waist was also injured. The old wound had not yet healed, and now there was a new one. The wound on Scylla's waist did not slow him down in the slightest. He swiftly ran away from that place. After blocking the needles, Osculos turned around and cut down the vines that were chasing him. Then he ran after Scylla in a flash. Just as Osculos's sword was about to reach Scylla's back, Osculos suddenly felt dizzy. After all, he was an experienced fighter. He quickly noticed that something was wrong with his body, as well as the things that had burrowed into his body. He had always thought that they were just spiders in the forest. He did not expect them to be parasites, and parasites that secrete poisonous substances at that. Osculos stopped attacking Scylla first. He knew all too well how powerful these little things were, so he began to mobilize his muscles and even his internal organs. The sudden tightening of his muscles crushed the parasites to death. Scylla, who had not gotten far, was shocked to see this. Until now, Scylla had only seen Osculos do something like this. Other people could not even stop the parasites from moving, much less kill them. He might be able to kill the parasites, But could he resist the poisonous substances that the parasites secrete? The parasites were not living creatures. They preferred dead bodies. Therefore, when they chose a suitable host, they would kill the living host and then absorb the substances needed for their growth at this stage from the dead host. This substance would only be produced when the host was in the process of decay. There were some on the lizard as well, but the lizard was competing with the vines for nutrients, so the most attractive parasite in this area was Osculose. Compared to viruses, the parasites had independent thought processes. These parasites were one of the parasites that Bart had given to Cylin. Cylin had modified the parasites' genes a little to create them. The parasites secreted venom that could quickly lower the host's blood pressure and prevent the blood from clotting. Normal hosts, even those with rank A genotypes, would pass out before they could even struggle. After that, the host would bleed for hours until they died. Ordinary wounds wouldn't be like this. Ordinary wounds would stop bleeding very quickly. Osculose could clearly feel that his spirit was not as focused as before. The wound that Cylin had left on his body had not healed immediately, and it was still bleeding. The vines around him pounced on him again. Cylin did not dare to run too far away. If he ran out of this area, he would have nothing to rely on. The other areas did not have this many vines, nor did they have such a good environment for them to grow. Osculose could not wait for Cylin to leave this place, so Cylin would not let him do as he wished. He jumped between the vines, using the dead lizards and the vines as cover. Whenever he found an opportunity, he would shoot his fiber needles at Osculose and cause him trouble. Osculose was confused. Why did the vines not go after Cylin instead of him? There was no way he would believe that this had nothing to do with Cylin. Cylin admired Osculose's physique for being able to withstand the parasite's venom for so long. Osculose blocked the fiber needles that Cylin shot at him, but as the venom seeped into his body and more parasites floated over, he was under a lot of pressure. Unfortunately, Cylin was very slippery. He almost got hit a few times, but the kid still managed to slip past him. As for why the vines kept chasing after Osculose, the answer was something that Osculose would never have guessed. The fiber needles were not merely corrosive, as Osculose had thought. They were coated with some kind of drug that could excite both the vines and the parasites. Just like how Udo's blood had made the vines go crazy, the vines were now looking at Osculose like he was blood. Even the blood of the lizards did not excite them as much as they did. These drugs had drained a lot of Cylin's energy and brain cells. Cylin had experimented with them before, and even Cylin's special body could not block the venom immediately. It would take him some time to expel the venom, which was why he was confident that he could use the parasites to deal with Osculose. Only when he was prepared would he have the confidence and the opportunity. Osculose kept using his knife to block the fiber needles, so the smell naturally lingered on the knife. As long as the knife was not corroded, the smell would not dissipate. Osculose did not like to use guns, because he could not use the same bullet to kill every trophy. Osculose liked his knife very much. He used it to harvest every trophy, letting the blood of each trophy drip across the blade. It was as if the life of the trophy had flowed from the blade to the tip of the knife, and then dropped to the ground. That was why Osculose was not going to put down his sword easily, nor was he going to wash it. He did not expect the vines and parasites to do something like this. The reason for all of this was because of his knife. He had to focus on 3 things at the same time. He had to avoid the vines, prevent the parasites from entering his brain and organs, and stop Cylin from jumping around. Osculose was not a person who liked to avoid things, so when he first encountered the vines, his first choice was to slash at them. Now, however, he was forced to avoid them. It had been a long time since Osculose had been this angry. He was now surrounded by a thick, murderous aura. A normal person would have retreated a long time ago, but 2 of the 3 creatures that Osculose was facing were not human. The only human he was facing was an anomaly. Right now, Cylin's goal was to stall for time. Osculose was very stubborn when it came to his prey, and he was still angry. He looked like he would not stop until he killed Cylin. "I'm not afraid of your anger, but I'm afraid you won't be angry." A person's thought process would be affected by anger. Still, Scylla had to admit that Osculos's attack power was incredible when he was enraged. The giant lizard's carcass had been destroyed in a single hit, but Scylla was lucky that he had dodged the attack in time. The only reason he hadn't turned into mincemeat was because they were blocking his path. That should be enough. While Scylla was dodging the vines, he took out a gun from his ring. It looked the same as the one he had used before, but the bullets were different. Osculos was regretting his decision. When did the parasites enter his body? That's right, back then, when the kid was hiding in the lizard cave and fiddling with the bullets, he deliberately released the sound for him to hear, so that he would be vigilant and pay more attention to the bullets, instead of the parasites that were drifting over. The parasites' toxins were too strong. Osculos's body could not withstand it, and the toxins were getting deeper and deeper. If this continued, he would die. If he could not finish off the kid in 2 minutes, Osculos would have to leave for now and go after Scylla after the toxins were removed. But Osculos did not want to give up. He was a star hunter, but he was forced to this extent by a nobody. If the military saw him like this, they would laugh at him. While Osculos was thinking, Scylla hid among the vines and fired at him again. 8 bullets flew at Osculos from 8 different directions, almost surrounding him. You want me to retreat? I won't. Osculos's stubbornness led him to take the wrong step. Scylla had never fired 8 bullets in a row before, but Osculos did not think too much about it. He did not think about the difference between these 8 bullets and the ones before. He swung his sword and blocked all 8 bullets. However, when the knife came into contact with the bullets exploded. Even though the scale of the explosion was not that big, and it was only 5 meters away from Osculos, the shockwave from the explosion still affected Osculos quite a bit. Wounds appeared on his body from the explosions, and blood flowed out of them. Due to the parasite toxin's ability to dilate blood vessels and inhibit blood clotting, a lot of blood flowed out of the wounds even though they weren't that big. Osculos' blood had stimulated the vines, and they swarmed toward Lucian. Osculos was a human, not a steel beast. He knew where his limit was, and the new wounds allowed the poison to spread even further. Osculos had to spend time recuperating and expelling the poison from his body. The blood he had lost had also caused him to lose a lot of oxygen, and his movements were a lot slower than they had been before. Osculos cut down the vines that pounced at him with his sword. He stood there and looked at Scylla, who was jumping between the vines and the lizard's carcass. It felt like he was standing in an even colder place. Scylla saw the look in Osculos's eyes. He knew that Osculos was going to leave for now, but Scylla did not let his guard down. He kept changing his position so that Osculos would not have a chance. The details were the deciding factor. Against someone like Osculos, Scylla could not afford to be careless for even a second. Osculos's hovercraft flew over, and Osculos turned around and jumped. Osculos did not like to retreat, so even if he wanted to leave, he only turned around and jumped with his back to Scylla. He was not afraid of Scylla attacking him from behind. It was hard to say whether Osculos was overconfident or arrogant. Either way, Scylla did not attack him. Right now, Scylla's body was almost at its limit. In order to maintain his high speed and evade Osculos's attack, he injected himself with 3 vials of Riculab stimulant. 3 vials was the theoretical limit Riculab told him, and 2 vials was already the limit for Scylla and Scylla's group. Any more than that and they would explode and die. Osculos stepped on the treetops and jumped right into the hatch that had just opened. Osculos would not use the hovercraft's weapons against Scylla. The more he hated Scylla, the more he wanted to kill him. Scylla spat out a mouthful of blood as he watched the hovercraft rise into the air. The vines, however, were not excited by Scylla's blood. Scylla had been injected with the relevant drugs, so his blood was still in it. Scylla had also sprayed some on himself, so the vines and parasites were not affected by Scylla at all. After Osculos left, the vines and parasites shifted their target to the dead lizard. Not even Scylla had planned to kill Osculos directly. He was a star rank hunter after all, and even if he was a stubborn, twisted, and dictatorial star rank hunter, he was still a star rank hunter. This time, Scylla realized the difference between them. Scylla leaned against the lizard's body and sat down. He had just caught his breath when he suddenly looked up at the sky and smiled. Osculos, I can only say that you're unlucky today. After Osculos entered the hovercraft, he set it on autopilot and started to recover. He did not like to rely on drugs. Every time he endured a drug or poison, his body would automatically develop a resistance and improve his constitution. Osculos liked this feeling. Just as Osculos was about to recover and expel the poison, he abruptly opened his eyes and enveloped the entire hovercraft with his telekinesis. Normally, Osculos would have made sure that nothing would go wrong, but in his current state he was still a bit lacking. From a small area to a large area, from the thrusters to the control panel, the invasion program was pretty strong. Osculos stared in a certain direction. A hovercraft had burst out of the clouds and revealed itself. It was none other than Huimao and Cheto's hovercraft. Right now, Osculos had to defend against two powerful invaders, Huimao and Cheto. If Huimao and Cheto broke through the defense line, Osculos's hovercraft would go out of control. Or rather, the hovercraft would change owners. The green characters in Huimao's eyes were flashing brightly. Cheto wasn't idling around either. Enveloped by Osculos's telekinesis, the hovercraft's magnetic field was a hindrance to Huimao and Cheto. On the ground, Scylla took out a handheld electromagnetic cannon. He had never thought of using this thing against Osculos because it was too weak to lock onto someone like Osculos. But now was the time to do so. Osculos didn't have the spare energy to defend himself against Huimao and Cheto if he wanted to dodge the electromagnetic cannon. If he wanted to defend himself against Huimao and Cheto, he would have to endure the bombardment. So, which one will you choose, Osculos? You can only choose one of them in your current state. A bright beam of white light shot straight at Osculos's hovercraft. In the end, Osculos chose to dodge it. But before he could envelop the hovercraft with his telekinesis again, Huimao had destroyed the hovercraft's energy system. Boom! The flames of the explosion shot out in all directions, even covering the original natural light, startling the animals on the ground and causing them to scurry around. He had to admit that Huimao and Cheto's arrival timing was perfect. They didn't give Osculos any time to recover at all. If Osculos had recovered just a little bit, he would have had a chance to escape. But clearly, the god of fortune wasn't on his side this time. Scylla thinks that Gaidar had predicted this outcome. That was why he said what he said at the time. Scylla flew toward the hovercraft as he watched the debris fall from the sky. Scylla wouldn't feel at ease until he was sure that Osculos was truly dead. The wreckage of the hovercraft landed in the forest, and the forest was ablaze. The rain that had not lasted for long did not make things any better. The trees that could burn were still burning, and the moisture was quickly evaporating. Amidst the flames, a figure pushed aside the uneven steel plate above him and staggered out. The clothes on his body were burnt, and his skin was charred black. However, there was still blood gushing out. This unforeseen event had caused the poison to seep deeper into his body, and the blood vessels had expanded to an extremely life-threatening degree. However, the wound did not heal much. Osculos's current state could not be described as wretched. No one would believe that this was the star hunter Osculos, the Lone Ranger. Even though there was not a single part of his body that was unscathed, Osculos was still holding his sword. The blade was still gleaming coldly, and it had not changed in the slightest because of the sudden change. Osculos turned his head stiffly in a certain direction, and then started walking in that direction. He started running faster and faster, and with every step he took, the wound on his body widened. Logically speaking, what he needed to do right now was find a quiet place to recuperate. He should not be doing such strenuous exercise. But right now, Osculos's life and death were no longer his concern. When he sensed that the cunning prey was getting closer and closer, there was only one thing left in his mind: kill the prey. Sensing Osculos's movement, Scylla turned around and ran. He did not expect Osculos to be able to run so fast in his current condition. The distance between the two of them was shrinking. Scylla was already trying to find a way to hide behind the trees, hoping to use them as cover to block Osculos's path. However, he did not expect Osculos to be so agile. It was like the shadow of a black ghost. Only the bloodstains on the ground indicated that such a person had passed through here. Right now, Osculos was like a soul reaper from hell. His aura was terrifying to the extreme. Osculos was getting closer and closer. Scylla could already feel the hairs on his body trembling. I can't escape. If I can't escape, then... When Osculos's blade came slashing at him, Scylla turned around abruptly and ran into Osculos. He swung his wrist blade even faster. Splat. The sounds overlapped, and it was impossible to tell whose flesh they came from. On Scylla's shoulder, there was a 10-centimeter-long wound that extended from his left shoulder to his chest. Scylla's wrist blade was still stuck to Osculos's neck. Drip, drip, blood dripped down in large droplets. Both Scylla's and Osculos's. Scylla had wanted to cut off Osculos's head, but he was surprised that he could not. He had only managed to cut a small wound, and the blade was still stuck there. Fortunately, the artery had been severed. The flow of blood wasn't as intense as a normal person's anymore. Osculos's blood pressure was so low that he was close to death's door, but he still had the strength to chase after Scylla and stab him. A giant claw had penetrated Osculos's heart, and there were two hands on the blade. One belonged to Scylla, and the other belonged to Cheto. Without Cheto's hand, the blade would have cut Scylla in half already. If Huemao's claw hadn't penetrated Osculos's heart, he could have delivered another blow. It was a close shave, and every factor was critical. Splat. Huemao crushed Osculos's head with a single swipe. The headless Osculos was standing tall despite being stabbed in the heart. The blade in his hand trembled a little, but it didn't loosen its grip. It looked like he was going to stab Scylla again. Osculos was a legend. He didn't rely on any force or organization, and he had fought his way to the top all by himself. More than half of the violent groups and underground organizations in the League of Stars had Osculos's shadow behind them. Or rather, Osculos was the one who created them and allowed them to usurp power from the older generation and become a special underground force in the League of Stars. However, Osculos had never stopped for a single person. He was a stubborn loner who brought blood and took it with him. A man like him was destined to die a tragic death in this era. Even if he didn't fall into Scylla's hands today, he would one day fall into the hands of the military or the cunning politicians. Osculos's existence was to keep the leaders of the underground forces in check. They weren't afraid of the military or the 4 great hunter regiments. They were only afraid of one person, and that was Osculos. Once Osculos was gone, the entire underground force would descend into chaos. What would happen to the League of Stars then? Scylla collapsed to the ground. Even though Osculos's final attack hadn't been complete, it had still dealt a heavy blow to Scylla. If it was someone else who suffered such a wound, they would probably have died. Huemao kicked the headless Osculos aside and transformed back into his metallic form. Then he ran up to Scylla and circled him. "Are you all right, Scylla? Are you going to die? Do you need some blood? Do you need..." Cheto sprayed some medicine on Scylla's wound and stopped the bleeding first. "All right, don't touch me for now. I'll recover on my own." After that, Scylla closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep. Huemao crouched down and looked at Scylla. Then he moved closer to Scylla and pricked up his ears to listen to Scylla's heartbeat and breathing. Then his ears drooped. Things didn't look good. We suddenly remembered something and ran back to Osculos's side. Then, it turned around and ran back to where Osculos was. Osculos was still gripping his sword tightly in the same position as before. There was the sound of flesh being torn apart, followed by a burst of energy. Then, there was a loud bang, followed by Huemao's angry voice. "Meow meow. What kind of sword is that?" Chapter 217. Cheto was analyzing Osculos's tissue sample he snatched from Huemao's mouth when he heard Huemao's cry. There was a cat tooth lying next to him, and Huemao was running circles around it. Osculos had turned to ash, but the blade he left behind was still intact. Huemao clenched his teeth, but a moment of carelessness caused his own tooth to fall out. A blade that could break a cat's tooth had to be extraordinary. It had to be a very special blade. Cheto analyzed the blade for a moment, but he couldn't find a key element in it that wasn't recorded in his database. Cheto's body was made of a very special material, but this blade had almost severed his entire hand. Of course, he could reattach his hand very quickly even if it was severed. Let's keep this blade until Sillin wakes up. Cheto put the blade aside and continued analyzing Osculos's DNA. Osculos's genes were a lot better than a rank A, and several times stronger than an A+ constitution. His genes were a little similar to Sillin's, but his DNA helix was different from other people's, and he didn't have a lot of silencing genes. Cheto analyzed Osculos's DNA sample before looking at Sillin again. Right now, Sillin's wounds were starting to heal. Maybe it was because of the severity of his injuries and the stimulant, but the healing speed was very slow. At the very least, his vital signs were stable. There was a starship parked not far away from Vanguard's assigned area. 2 people were sitting at a table in a room inside the starship. One of them looked relatively young, and he was playing with a yo-yo. He was watching the person opposite him flip the cards open and rearrange them. He didn't understand what they were doing, but it was interesting. Suddenly, the person opposite him put away all the cards on the table with a wave of his hand. Then he pulled out the topmost card, put it on the table, and flipped it over. The yo-yo player caught the card and paused for a moment before asking, "What's the meaning of this?" He didn't know what the patterns on the cards meant, but he had seen this card before. When this card appeared, an important person in the military had died. So who was it this time? Gaydar stared at the card and said indifferently, "Osculos." But the yo-yo in the man's hand broke into pieces. With a shake of his hand, the man shook off the debris and asked seriously, "Are you serious?" Gaydar glanced at him. "When did I joke about this?" The man took a deep breath. "If this is true, congratulations. You will soon replace Osculos as one of the 6 stars of the hunt." For the sake of balance, there had to be a new star hunter. The 6 stars of hunting and the 4 heavenly edict generals were indispensable. Gaydar didn't seem happy about the man's words. That person continued, "Second, this is really good news. The League of Stars is going to be chaotic." Following that person's words, Gaydar's second card fell. Looking at the patterns on the card, Gaydar frowned. "How could this be?" "What do you mean?" the man asked curiously when he saw Gaydar frown. Gaydar didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he said to the man, "The shortcut can be activated." "This is great. I've been waiting for this for a long time." By the time Sillin woke up, it was already night time in this part of the planet. Cheto had parked his spaceplane nearby, but both he and Huimao were guarding Sillin. Seeing that Sillin had woken up, the gray cat happily came over and rubbed his ears. Then, it bent its paw and showed the fallen cat tooth to Sillin. "Sillin, that blade broke one of my teeth." Sillin sat up and stared at the blade Cheto was holding. He said, "This blade is very strange." Sillin then pried Huimao's mouth open and looked inside. "New teeth grew out already?" "Of course," Huimao said proudly. Sillin rubbed his head. He had mostly recovered, but it would take some time for him to fully recover. The wound was healing very slowly. "Thank goodness you came in time, or you would have had to pay your respects to me in the future." The mention of this excited Huimao. He told Sillin about how he sensed Sillin's danger, how he used his extraordinary senses to determine the direction, and what happened at the base. Sillin scratched Huimao's chin and asked, "How's the base doing?" "It's fine. The starship left not long after," Cheto answered. "Didn't you say there was a rescue team? Why haven't they shown up yet?" Sillin looked at the time. It had been 2 days since he fell unconscious. Cheto's eyes flashed. "I only told them that you're fine. But I didn't tell them your exact coordinates. No wonder the rescue team didn't see a single person. That's fine too. Saves people the trouble of knowing what happened here." Sillin rose to his feet and put the blade back into his ring. Then he looked around. It was nighttime, but Sillin could see his surroundings clearly thanks to the faint light of the spaceplane. "You destroyed Osculos's body. Did you not see the star map fragment?" Sillin asked. Hui Mao opened his mouth and stuck out his tongue. There was a ring on it, but it was gray and dull. It looked very ordinary. A subspace container? It didn't collapse even after you tossed it around like that? Sillin picked up the ring and flicked its ears. Am I that stupid? Hui Mao raised his chin proudly. Sillin curled his lips inwardly. Who knows? He took out the star map from inside the ring and left the other items untouched. Then he tossed it back to the gray cat. Keep this ring for yourself and store your fish biscuits. However, don't touch the memory cards and materials inside, or trouble will come looking for you. If the military found out that they were the ones who killed Osculos, they'd definitely be on the lookout for it. Hui Mao's eyes narrowed into slits. All right, come on, let's return to the base. Cheto, give us a hand. Cheto helped Sillin up the spaceplane. Sillin was still staggering a little. Hui Mao walked at the front with his tail wagging. But before they boarded the spaceplane, Sillin, Cheto, and Cheto looked up at the same time. Who's here? Hui Mao looked up and flicked his ears. Whoever it is, it's not from the 6th Division, Sillin said. Cheto's eyes flashed. There's an external signal requesting communication. Connect. Gaidar's voice entered their ears as soon as the call connected. How do you feel? Gaidar asked with a smile. Sillin stared at Gaidar's image and let out a sigh. As a hunter, you should never give your prey too much time to prepare. Don't let them know too much about you, or they'll die a miserable death. The one who knew Osculos the most was Gaidar, not Sillin. If Gaidar hadn't told Sillin so many of Osculos' habits, Sillin wouldn't have been able to escape from Gaidar's blade, much less kill Osculos. The call ended after that. All Gaidar wanted to do was tell Sillin that they were here. It looks like we won't be able to return this time. Can you contact the base, Cheto? Not yet. I can't connect. Cheto looked at the sky. Something is interfering with the signal. Are we going to invade? Never mind. Gaidar must be fearless if he's here. Let's wait and see. Although he hadn't spent a lot of time with Gaidar, Sillin was sure that it wouldn't be easy even if Cheto and Hui Mao worked together to invade the base's interference system. After the spaceplane landed, Gaidar walked out. There were 2 people behind Gaidar. One of them was the invisible man Sillin had seen before, and the other was someone Sillin didn't recognize. It was Azrael's man. It looked like they were very familiar with each other. Who would have thought that Gaidar and Azrael were this close? Gaidar tossed something to Sillin, and Sillin caught it. It was a star map fragment, but it wasn't Sillin's type. It was probably the type Lung was looking for. Fulfill your promise. Are we going to open the shortcut now? Sillin asked. Gaidar nodded. This meant that they had all the remaining fragments. Judging from the man's expression, Sillin knew that he wasn't going to ask him to contact the 6th Division. There's no need to doubt it, Gaidar said as if he knew what Sillin was thinking. I've contacted Ji Feng. You'll meet him in a bit. Since we're working together, it's only natural that we show our sincerity. Sillin was confident in Ji Feng after witnessing Osculos' abilities. He was a little more confident with a star-rank hunter backing him up. Can I contact the commander? Sillin asked. No, but I can tell him what you want to say. All right then. Tell the commander to bring Sigma over, Shui Moyan said. Sigma? I don't know who you're talking about, but I'll grant your request. Gaidar shot a glance at the man playing with a yo-yo next to him. The man gave him a "there's nothing you can do about it" expression before returning to the spaceplane. A short while later, the man returned to his spaceplane. I've conveyed the message. Then he returned to his yo-yo. By the time Ji Feng arrived, it was already daytime in this area. Ji Feng had brought 5 people with him, all core members of the A-Team. When they learned that Sillin and Hui Mao had killed Osculos, the A-Team members behind Ji Feng stared at Sillin as if they'd seen a ghost. Ji Feng, however, simply smiled. Someone like Osculos would have done it sooner or later. That said, congratulations, Gaidar. You're about to become a star hunter. It looked like everyone had seen it clearly. However, the way Ji Feng looked at Sillin made Sillin's hair stand on end. It reminded Sillin of Elder Mo Hang. Sigma was silent when Ji Feng and the others brought it to the spaceplane. This was the first time it had come out in years, and it was only because of Ji Feng's shortcut. However, Sigma's silence shattered the moment it saw Silin and Hui Mao, and it started chatting with Hui Mao in robotic language. No one could understand what they were talking about. Knowing that Ji Feng was telling the truth, Sigma was so happy that the blue light on its face rippled like a wave. Silin took out 3 star map fragments, and the man playing with the yo-yo in Azrael, named Xan Zhao, took out 2. The moment the 5-star map fragments were taken out, they created a strong gravitational pull. When they combined into one, a complete star map appeared in front of them. However, it was only an image. There were no coordinates, and it was impossible to tell which sector they were in. A key appeared on the star map, and the words, "shortcut," were written on it. The key turned and pointed at Sigma, whose blue light was dancing wildly in excitement. "You can't know the destination without the key," Gaydar said. No one thought that the key was pointing at Sigma. They just assumed that it was in that direction. As soon as Gaydar finished speaking, Sigma's body glowed with light. It was a star map projection. The 2 star maps merged into one. The star map was complete, and one of the planets was flashing. It was the destination. This map. Ji Feng frowned and thought for a moment. "It seems to be near our group's territory." "It is," Xan Zhao said. "Juno just searched the star map, and it is indeed near Vanguard's territory." Silin's pupils shrank. "Juno? The creator of Al?" Gaydar smiled. "That's good. I was wondering what to do if we were in another force's territory." "Ha, I'm going back. I'm going to find Master." Sigma was so happy that he was spinning around in circles. Every member of the Reaper squad turned to look at him. They asked Sigma a few questions, but Sigma only gave them a simple answer without giving them any details. But now was not the time to bicker with Sigma over the details. After recording the star map, Silin boarded Ji Feng's spaceplane. Gaydar also boarded Ji Feng's spaceplane, and the rest of Azrael returned to the starship. Back on the spaceplane, Ji Feng told Silin about Osculos's death. He was very satisfied with Silin's performance, and the look in his eyes was even more similar to Mo Heng's. At the same time, Silin learned from Ji Feng that the people who attacked the 6th Division's base were from the Mist. The base didn't suffer much damage, and there were no casualties. Now that Osculo is dead, there will be chaos in the League of Stars. Those who were suppressed by Osculo will definitely make a move now that the shackles are gone. After the shortcut incident, everyone needs to be prepared for it. Ji Feng's words were directed at Silin. Silin was the one who made most of the decisions in the 6th Division, and Shotten's influence was gradually losing to Silin's. Moreover, many people in the A-team thought that Silin had long since replaced Shotten's position. Ji Feng's attitude showed how much he valued Silin. If it weren't for the fact that Silin was unwilling to be promoted to the A-team, Silin would have been promoted a long time ago. Since the location marked on the star map wasn't too far away, everyone arrived quickly. Their target planet was an inconspicuous D-rank planet. Even Ji Feng, Gaydar, and the others had to put on their protective suits. Sigma and Weiss took the lead and ran at the front. Everyone looked at them with envy. This was the benefit of being non-human. Hui Mao and Sigma didn't need to do much scouting and analysis before they found the planet. It was an entrance, and after passing through the entrance, everyone realized that the entire planet was a machine that could create a warp jump point. Sigma was the one who activated the machine, and it knew some of the commands it had stored in its memory since a long time ago. Knowing that it would soon be able to return home to its master after so many years excited Sigma, but at the same time, it was also filled with regret. Sigma wouldn't have felt this way before they met the people of the 6th Division. But now, it was a little reluctant. Maybe this was what humans called conflicting emotions. While Sigma was busy, Ji Feng, Gaydar, and Azrael asked about the shortcut. They all had the same plan: to verify the warp jump point and make sure it was safe before arranging for people to enter. They had to be prepared. "Are you sure this warp jump point works both ways?" Ji Feng asked Sigma. Sigma didn't answer him even though he was busy. Of course. How else would I have come here in the first place? Ji Feng had already told everyone that Sigma didn't belong to the League of Stars, but he had a feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't the warp jump point, but he had a feeling that things weren't going to go as he imagined. Ji Feng shot Gaydar a glance. He knew a little about Gaydar's capabilities, but Gaydar was just looking down at the ground. No one knew what he was thinking. Sillin was with Hui Mao and Cheto not far away. They weren't needed anymore. From a certain perspective, if Sillin didn't have the star map fragment, if Ji Feng and Jiada weren't protecting him, the Grim Reaper wouldn't have allowed him to stay in this place. In fact, they would have robbed him of the star map fragment a long time ago. Can this shortcut really take us to a place outside of the League of Stars star system, Sillin? Hui Mao asked. I think so. Sillin hadn't seen it before, so he couldn't be sure. Hui Mao licked his lips. I hope that the other side of the shortcut is a world with a lot of food and less crazy scientists. Sillin scratched Hui Mao's chin and didn't say anything. Every system had its own way of existence, and the complexity of every system was not the same. For example, in the Star Alliance, some places were peaceful and beautiful, some places were constantly in chaos, some places were prosperous, and some places were in dire straits. None of those things could be said for sure. But Sillin was more curious about the place where Sigma was made. At the same time, Sillin had an idea. Sillin had been investigating the Fuji House of Upper Tree for many years, but to no avail. He didn't know if there were clues on the other side of the shortcut. Ah, it's done! Sigma shouted. Everyone perked up when they heard this. Let's check the node's stability first, Sigma said. It didn't take long for Ji Feng, Gaydar, and Xen Zhao's communicators to ring. Ji Feng turned it on, and the person on the other end said excitedly, Commander, a space-time vortex has appeared outside. Let's go out and take a look. Sigma led the way and ran to the front. Since Sigma had gone out, the people inside followed suit. However, Sillin suddenly had a strange feeling in his heart. When they went out, the space-time vortex in the air was very clear, and it looked like it was growing bigger and bigger. So this is the shortcut. Hui Mao exclaimed as he looked at Sillin. Hui Mao was so shocked that all the hair on his body stood on end. Chapter 218. The magnetic field around Sillin suddenly grew stronger and stronger. Moreover, the space around Sillin's body had already started to distort. Sillin finally understood why he was feeling so strange. The curly leaf pattern on his finger was reacting to the open space-time vortex. An enormous suction force pulled Sillin towards him. To be more precise, the suction force was directed towards the leaf curl pattern. However, Sillin, who was stuck to the leaf curl pattern, had become the one receiving the suction force. A green light appeared from the curly leaf pattern and enveloped Sillin entirely. Sillin was standing at the back of the group. After all, the front was reserved for people like Gaydar and Ji Feng, so Sillin stood at the back of the group on his own accord. Right now, everyone was looking at the space-time vortex in space, and no one was paying attention to Sillin. That was why no one had noticed the anomaly at the beginning. When Hui Mao turned his head to look, the light had just come out from the curly leaf pattern. The light gave Hui Mao a very frightening feeling. Hui Mao often acted on instinct, so when he saw the light, a thought appeared in his mind. Sillin is going to the other side of the space-time vortex. That was why Hui Mao jumped over and hugged Sillin's arm with his claws. His tail was also tightly wrapped around Sillin's arm. Hui Mao had appeared in this world for many years, and Sillin was the only person he truly trusted. Everyone else, even the people of the 6th Division, Hui Mao's trust was still a little leeway. But what if something happened to Sillin or he suddenly disappeared? Would he be captured by those strange scientists and dissected? Also, he wouldn't starve as long as Sillin was around. If he was left alone, wouldn't he return to his original standard of living? Absolutely not. In fact, Hui Mao's actions were faster than his thoughts. The latter thoughts only came to his mind after he grabbed Sillin. Cheto was a beat too slow. By the time he arrived, the light had already enveloped both Sillin and Hui Mao, and he was directly knocked away. Even Ji-Feng and the rest couldn't get close to Silin. Moreover, the magnetic field around Silin was getting stronger and stronger. Silin and Huimao's silhouettes were starting to fade, so no one dared to force their way closer. Huimao spat out the ring from his mouth as he watched Cheto get bounced away. If he and Silin weren't here, would Cheto be lonely? Would he be harassed by the other members of Vanguard? Would he starve? Would he? No matter what, the items inside the ring were enough to support Cheto's independence. It must have been hard for the cat to think of such things for Cheto during such an emergency. Truth be told, Huimao thought that Silin was an absolute meal ticket and that he would definitely live a better life than Cheto. That was why Huimao took care of his own people. At first, Huimao wanted to say something to Cheto, but he didn't get the chance to do so. The light grew brighter and brighter, and Silin and Huimao's silhouettes grew more and more blurry. Finally, a ray of light flashed and shot straight into the spatial vortex above them. After the light entered the spatial vortex, it slowly weakened until it disappeared completely. Everything returned to its original state. However, the surroundings were dead silent. There was no communication. Everyone stared blankly at the vanishing space-time vortex. Did the shortcut they'd been waiting for disappear just like that? Ignoring everyone else's thoughts, Cheto reached out and caught the ring Huimao had spat at him. Then, he closed his fingers around the ring and held it firmly in his palm. This was the ring he stripped from Osculos. Huimao had always treated it like a treasure, and Silin had even planned to use it as a granary for Huimao and Cheto. But now, Cheto was the only one left. Cheto tried to contact Huimao and Silin, but he couldn't get a single life signal from them. Neither Silin nor Huimao could be reached through their communicators. It was as if the two of them had vanished into thin air. Both of them had vanished just like that. Although he was just a robot, Cheto was experiencing a feeling he'd never felt before. He couldn't put his finger on it because it was too complicated. If he had to describe it in one word, it would be painful. Very, very painful. Sigma would express its thoughts completely, but Cheto was a lot more reserved. He still wore the same expressionless face he'd used all year round, but his eyes were starting to show a lot of emotions. It was just that Cheto didn't let anyone see it because he was staring at the ring on his finger. Sigma let out a confused cry as the blue bars on its face turned into several big vertical lines. Sigma's cry snapped Gaydar and the others back to reality. Did they go in? Xen Zhao asked. Gaydar and the others didn't say anything. This shouldn't be happening. This shouldn't be happening. Sigma yelled and charged into the passageway to check on the machine. Ji-Feng and the others followed him into the passageway. They wanted to know what the fuck was going on. Sigma covered his head with both hands after he entered the passageway. The blue bars on his face were flashing irregularly. It was clear how chaotic his emotions were right now. All of the machine's energy had been used up, and the connection node's programming was messed up. Some of the instruments were suffering from major or minor problems, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that their programming was messed up or damaged. It would take a lot of time to fix them. Huimao had created a kind of machine language radiation before he was sucked into the space-time vortex. Even Cheto and Sigma were affected for a moment, but they were special enough to survive it. The same couldn't be said for the other instruments. Be it the spaceplanes parked not far away or the instruments inside the planet, everything was affected and their programming was messed up. Even Death's starship, which had retreated relatively far away because of the space-time vortex, was affected and lost control for a while. Sigma sobbed as he stared at the instruments. Then he looked at Cheto and asked, "What do? We can't use the shortcut for now. How long will it take before we can use the shortcut again?" Cheto asked. Ji-Feng and the others were also listening attentively. Probably 3 to 5 years. I can't say for sure. Sigma stared at the string of characters and a flashing icon on the central screen. In the end, he let out a sigh and didn't finish his sentence. Both Gaydar and Ji-Feng asked Sigma some questions, but the answer they got was ridiculous. Silin and Whis might have been sent to the other side of the space-time vortex. I don't know why, Sigma said with a frustrated and aggrieved expression. Its trip home was ruined, and both Sillin and Hui Mao were gone. It was going to be lonely. Sillin didn't know what the others would think after he left. He felt like he was isolated after the green light enveloped him, and he lost consciousness the moment the green light shot toward the space-time vortex. A long time later, he finally regained consciousness. Right now, Sillin felt like his entire body had been torn apart and pieced back together. It was so painful that he couldn't even begin to describe it. There was a lot of noise, the sound of thrusters and flying cars, the sound of people shouting something, the sound of metal falling to the ground. Everything slowly quieted down. A while later, Sillin opened his eyes. The scene in front of him reminded Sillin of the small room he used to live in on planet Brown Earth. The room was simple and crude. One could even call it shabby. There was an old robot sitting in the corner with its wiring exposed. It looked like it had been there for a long time because a layer of dust had covered its body. Celine moved his fingers. He felt fine. But sitting up took a lot of Sillin's strength. His muscles hurt like they were branded with iron. He hadn't recovered from the injuries he had suffered from Osculo, and he had experienced a painful trip to the space-time vortex. Sillin was in so much pain that he had to suck in a deep breath. He finally recovered. Exhaling, Sillin saw Hui Mao hugging his arm like an octopus. But now, Hui Mao didn't move. He was frozen in place and wasn't breathing. Sillin could feel Hui Mao's life force. Although the guy didn't breathe or have a heartbeat, he was still alive. Sillin flicked Hui Mao's ear. He didn't move. He poked his belly. Still didn't move. Sillin frowned. Did it crash? Sillin was still wearing the same clothes, but the protective suit was left on a shelf next to him. It was torn in many places. Suddenly sensing something, Sillin turned to look. The peeper shrank back, but not long after. 1 head, 2 heads, 3 heads. 3 very similar round heads popped out from the door. They didn't look very big. They were looking at Sillin with wide eyes. Their eyes were full of curiosity, but they were also a little scared. They were really kids. They showed their thoughts on their faces. Sillin smiled at them but didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what was going on and was afraid of saying something wrong. A smile could show kindness, especially to kids. They could get encouragement from a smile. Seeing Sillin smile at them, the 3 were encouraged and smiled back at Sillin. Although the decorations in the room were shabby, which meant the owner wasn't well off, the 3 had chubby faces. They didn't look malnourished. It was obvious that the owner cared a lot about the children's growth. One of the little kids shrank his head and ran away, shouting something. Sillin couldn't understand. It was a strange place indeed. Sillin knew the regional languages of all the sectors in the League of Stars, but Sillin didn't understand what the kid was shouting. After 1 little bean left, one of the remaining 2 little beans was a little braver. He slowly walked over, crouched beside the bed and looked at Celine. He said something, but Celine couldn't understand him. The kid said something again. Sillin made a puzzled expression to show that he didn't understand. But he was a kid after all, so he didn't think about whether Sillin could understand the language. He turned and said something to the kid who was still peeking out from the door. As they were talking, footsteps came from outside the door. It was obviously an adult. An old man was pulled in by the little kid who ran away just now. He walked in with a loving smile on his face. He looked old with a hunched back, but he was in good spirits and could be considered healthy. His hands were rough and full of calluses. When he saw Sillin sitting up, he said something. Sillin looked at the old man in puzzlement, showing that he didn't understand what they were saying. Even the other little kid pounced on the old man, pointing at Sillin and saying something. Old Chang was repairing the machine when his grandson ran over to say that the person they brought back was awake. He was sitting on the bed and smiling at the 3 of them. Old Chang put down the work in his hands and was pulled by his grandson by the finger. Because it was the triplets' birthday, Old Chang promised to take them for a trip outside the planet. A few days ago, he took a trip outside the planet in his broken little space plane. But on their planet, they couldn't afford the energy consumption of the space plane, not to mention the quality of the space plane, and not to mention whether it could perform long-distance navigation and warp-speed flight. It was already good enough for a family like theirs to barely maintain the maintenance costs of an old spaceplane. To solve the problem of energy, Old Chang had saved up for a long time to make this trip. And with the condition of their spaceplane, they couldn't leave the planet at all. They could only fly around symbolically. Fortunately, his grandson had sharp eyes and saw the person floating in space. Because Silin was wearing a protective suit at the time, Old Chang automatically classified Silin as an engineer working in space. Space missions were dangerous. One careless mistake and one would be thrown into space and then abandoned. Old Chang knew many situations like this. Many engineers died in space like this. The rich would use maintenance robots, but the poor could only rely on manpower. They couldn't afford that kind of maintenance robot, and they didn't trust the cheap maintenance robots. So, more people who couldn't afford it tended to hire maintenance engineers to complete the work in space. The money they earned was earned with their lives on the line. When Old Chang was young, he also did such things. But now that he was old, he couldn't let go of the little ones at home. He didn't come into contact with such things anymore and just focused on his current job. Old Chang also saw Hui Mao wrapped around Silin's arm. Old Chang sighed. It wasn't easy to have such a loyal pet. Unfortunately, when they found this person, Hui Mao was already stiff. It must have been dead for a long time. If Hui Mao knew what Old Chang was thinking, he would definitely be furious. Old Chang had never seen the type of protective suit Silin was wearing before. Old Chang guessed that this person might not be from this planet. But Old Chang was someone who had done space maintenance work, after all. He had a good impression of Silin. When he saw Silin's age, he felt even more sorry for him. Such a young man actually took on such a dangerous job. If he hadn't met them or if his protective suit hadn't been torn, he would have been dead. Silin's protective suit was only torn after Old Chang rescued Silin. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to save Silin. He wouldn't even have been able to feed him the pills. According to his grandson, this person seemed a little slow, but Old Chang felt that this young man didn't understand what they were saying. After thinking about it, Old Chang switched to a different language. He spoke in the imperial capital's language with a strong accent, which was also the common language of the empire. Can you understand me? Silin really did understand these words. At the same time, Silin was shocked. This was very similar to the language that Genya taught him when he was young. Genya said that it was the language of his hometown, but Silin hadn't found such a language in the League of Stars. He didn't expect to be able to hear it here. Yes, I can understand some of it, Silin said tentatively. However, the 11-year-old twins, Chang Little 3 and Chang Little 4, lived up to expectations. They got into a good school and left this area to study. As for Chang Little 5, he was born with a poor body because of the setbacks he experienced in his mother's womb. He often fell sick and grew up on medication. Old Chang now earned some basic living expenses in his small repair shop to support himself and his children. This area of the planet was densely packed with families similar to Old Chang's family. They opened a small repair shop in their own homes to support their families. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.